The candles burn low, their light trembling in the chill of the room. The air smells faintly of camphor and sickness, sweet, then sour, then still. Each cough that breaks the silence sounds like it comes from the walls themselves, from the very bones of the house. Outside, carriages rattle over cobblestones slick with frost, and every passerby moves with a handkerchief pressed to their lips, afraid to breathe too deeply. The city is haunted, not by ghosts, but by the living pale figures with hollow eyes, leaving trails of blood on white linen. It is the height of the Victorian age, an empire of invention, of elegance, of death. The same hands that built railways and steamships now tremble around medicine bottles, laudanum vials, and the fine lace of mourning veils. The disease moves quietly through parlors and factories alike, slipping between kisses and shared cups of tea, carried in the breath of those who never suspect it. They call it consumption, for it eats from within lungs, turning to lace, ribs showing like prison bars beneath translucent skin. Some call it weakness, others call it divine punishment. But history will name it for what it was, the White Plague. It will take poets, queens, and paupers the same. It will make beauty itself a symptom and love, the deadliest contagion of all. So today, stay close to the light, keep the windows shut, and listen, because this is how the White Plague began, when breath itself became a weapon, and the world learned to fear the sound of a cough. The morning light does not enter this room the way it used to. It filters weakly through the lace curtains, turning dust into drifting gold. You lie awake, listening to the quiet tick of the mantel clock and the slow, uneven rhythm of your own breath. The fire has long gone out, leaving behind the faint scent of coal and the whisper of ash. Somewhere beyond the walls, London stirs, carriages clatter. Milkmen call, but in here, time moves differently. The air feels heavy, as though it, too, has grown tired. A cough begins softly, the way a footstep echoes in an empty hall. It catches, trembles, then deepens raw, red, unstoppable. The sound startles even the cat from its chair. A handkerchief appears, white as snow, and when it lowers, the stain left behind blooms darkly like a secret. You press it closed, fold it neatly, and hide it beneath the pillow. For now, there's no need to tell anyone. Not yet. It's only a small thing. You think a cold, a chill from last night's fog. But deep inside your chest, something else knows better. The doctor will come soon, his boots clean, his bag polished like a coffin's lid. He'll smell faintly of tobacco and winter air. He'll press the stethoscope against your ribs and ask you to breathe, and you'll obey, though the air feels like glass. His face will not change, not even when you see the flicker of pity behind his eyes. He'll call it by its old soft name, consumption, as if the body were quietly eating itself, as if death had manners. He'll speak of rest, of milk, of clean country air. He won't say cure. Outside, the city exhales smoke from every chimney, every factory, every breath of progress. The same air that built empires now turns on its makers. In Whitechapel and Mayfair alike, the same hollow cough echoes through walls and stairwells. Children faint on their way to school. Seamstresses stitch until their fingers bleed, coughing into cloth that will soon be sold as fashion. Even poets write of beauty in dying young pale cheeks, soft sighs, the romance of slow decay. They call it the disease of the sensitive, as though suffering were a kind of art. By nightfall, the fog rolls in again, thick and silver under the gaslights. You hear the neighbors coughing through the plaster, a chorus of lungs trying to remember what clean feels like. The house smells of boiled linens and burning vinegar. Somewhere, a mother prays over her child's sleep, mistaking stillness for peace. And you, still awake, watch your breath cloud the window pane, a ghost rising and vanishing into the glass. It is such a fragile thing, this act of living. Each inhale a negotiation, each exhale a surrender. The clock ticks on, the candles burn lower, and somewhere in the silence between coughs, you realize what the doctors already know. The plague has come, not with rats or filth or fire, but with something far gentler, your own breath. It begins here, in this quiet room, with the faint tremble of lungs learning to die. The curtains stay drawn now, even at midday. The house feels dim, almost underwater, the air thick with the weight of stillness. Light only creeps in at the edges, as if afraid of what it might find inside. Every sound, every cough, every footstep on the floorboards echoes too loudly, then dies too quickly. It's as though the walls themselves are listening. In the hallway, portraits hang in shadow. The faces in them, stern ancestors, painted smiles seem to look away, unwilling to witness what the family is becoming. In the drawing room, a clock ticks without rhythm. Time has grown hesitant here. The servants move softly, gloved hands and lowered eyes, carrying trays of broth and damp towels. They open no windows. The master insists it keeps out the chill, but the truth is simpler. No one wants the neighbours to hear the coughing. In Victorian London, sickness is not merely an affliction, it is a stain. Respectability is a fragile thing, and death, when it comes too visibly, can ruin a reputation faster than scandal. So they hide it. The curtains close, the visitors stop calling, and the family begins to speak in lowered tones, as though words themselves might carry contagion. "She's a bit delicate," they say. "A touch of the lungs." The phrase is soft, almost tender, but the meaning is sharp. Everyone knows what it means. Upstairs, the sick room has become a world of its own. Bowls of lavender water line the bedside, meant to sweeten the air. Damp cloths rest on the patient's forehead, and the sound of shallow breathing fills the space between the creaks of the house. The doctor comes and goes, leaving behind little bottles of laudanum and instructions written in a precise, hopeless hand. Rest, warmth, clean air, no excitement, no strain. Outside, the world continues unbothered. Coal smoke thickens over the city, horses stumble on wet stones, and factory whistles split the morning air. Somewhere, a newspaper boy shouts the latest death counts, but inside this shuttered house, time folds in on itself. The sick girl dreams of gardens she will never see again, of spring air and sunlight that no longer belongs to her. Her mother sits nearby, mending the same hem over and over until her fingers bleed, because to stop would be to think. Sometimes, at night, she opens the curtains just a little, just enough to see the moonlight settle on the rooftops. The fog glows white around the chimneys, ghostly and pure. For a moment, it almost looks peaceful. Then she hears it again, that low, rattling cough from the bed. It sounds too deep for such a small body, too final. She closes the curtain quickly, as if darkness could protect them. The house breathes shallowly with its occupants. The fire crackles, the curtains flutter, the air grows stale. Outside, life moves on, markets open, carriages pass, but inside, behind those heavy drapes, the world has stopped turning. And so another family learns what so many already know, that in the age of progress and invention, it is not war or famine that steals your children first. It is the quiet, patient hunger of the White Plague, waiting behind closed curtains. They used to speak of it softly, almost reverently, as though the illness were an artist of its own kind. Consumption, they called it, never tuberculosis. The word itself felt lighter, more poetic, something that drifted from the tongue instead of crawling from the lungs. In parlours and poetry circles, it became the language of tragedy and beauty, of thin wrists and trembling sighs. They said it lent a kind of grace, that pale translucence, that fragile glow before the end. A gentle death, they said, a beautiful one. The painters adored it. They chased that faint pink in the cheeks, the fever's bloom, the glimmer in the eyes that no healthy body could imitate. In portraits, the afflicted looked almost angelic, slender, serene, touched by suffering in a way that made them seem closer to heaven. Poets wrote of it as if death were a lover who arrived quietly, whispering through lace curtains, carrying peace instead of pain. Young men compared their pale muses to lilies, and women frail from illness, were praised for their delicate melancholy. It was not decay, they said. It was refinement. But the truth was crueler. Consumption did not arrive with soft hands, it came with fire in the lungs and blood on the lips. The gentle death could take years, stripping the body inch by inch until the bones showed through silk sleeves. Each breath became a confession, each night a vigil for what would not recover. Families sat beside bedsides and spoke in whispers, because even words felt too heavy for the dying. The myths began in the parlors of the rich, but they spread quickly. The poor could not afford to call it beautiful. In the slums, where soot coated every wall and 20 people shared a single room, the same disease was filth, not art. It moved from factory to alley, from child to mother, unseen but ever present. The poor died fast, without poetry or portraiture. They were buried in rows, their names forgotten by morning. And yet, the poets still wrote of beauty. They never came to the slums to see what beauty truly cost. By the 1840s, the legend of the romantic illness had hardened into belief. Young girls mimicked the look: corsets tighter, diets smaller, cheeks pinched just enough to suggest a touch of frailty. To be delicate was to be desirable. To be pale was to be pure. Fashion itself began to echo disease. Even as doctors whispered of contagion, society embraced the aesthetic of death. But behind every drawing room and every elegy was a reality that could not be painted away. Lungs filling with liquid, ribs cracking under the strain of breath, bedsheets that smelled of iron and despair. There was nothing gentle in it, nothing kind. Only the long unraveling of the human body under the weight of its own air. And yet, in parlors lit by candlelight, they still called it beautiful. They still smiled at the pale ones, the coughing ones, as though envy might keep them alive a little longer. In an age that worshipped grace and control, tuberculosis became the one death that seemed acceptable, slow enough to admire, tragic enough to love. A gentle death, they said. But those who heard the coughing through the walls knew better. The night begins quietly enough. The clock on the mantel ticks with its familiar calm. The coals crackle softly, and the sound of a quill scratches faintly from another room. Then, from upstairs, it comes the sound no household wishes to hear. A cough, then another, then the sudden hollow rasp that follows when the lungs give way. There is a pause, a silence that seems to hold its breath, and then the sound of something wet striking fabric. By the time the candle is lit and the family gathers at the door, the damage is already done. On the bedsheet, beneath trembling hands, is the unmistakable bloom of crimson. It spreads slowly, seeping into the weave like ink on paper. The handkerchief clutched against pale lips is soaked through, its whiteness ruined. The father turns away. The mother's voice trembles as she whispers her child's name, as if saying it softly might undo what's been seen. This is the moment when fear stops being superstition and becomes fact. Until now, it might have been nerves, exhaustion, a passing chill. But blood means certainty. Blood means that death has moved in and made itself comfortable. From this night forward, nothing will smell quite clean again. Every sheet washed will carry a trace of it. Every breath drawn in this room will taste faintly of iron and regret. The servants will be warned to keep silent. No one must speak of what they've seen, especially not to the neighbors. The laundry will be done in secret, hung to dry in the attic instead of the yard. The doctor will come at dawn, as he always does, his bag heavy with tonics and sympathy. He will speak of rest, of climate, of God's will, but his eyes will linger on the stains. He knows, as they all do, that once blood shows, it is no longer a question of recovery, it is a countdown. In households across London, the same ritual plays out night after night. Mothers turn away to hide their tears. Fathers count the cost of another doctor's visit. Sheets are boiled and windows cracked open despite the cold. And through it all, the coughing continues, a steady, rhythmic reminder that breath is not guaranteed. In the candlelight, the droplets look almost beautiful, dark and glistening like spilled wine. For a brief, awful moment, One could almost understand why poets called it romantic, but beauty here is only disguise. Outside, the fog thickens over the city, pressing against glass and chimney. The air carries soot and sickness alike. In Whitechapel, laundresses cough into their washwater, unaware that the blood they scrub from linen mirrors their own. In Mayfair, carriages roll past houses with shuttered windows, where the wealthy die in silence, their linens burned before dawn. And so, the city learns the sound of it, the soft, terrible music of life leaving the body. A cough, a gasp, the whisper of cloth soaking through. It becomes the background rhythm of Victorian nights. No bells ring for it, no sermons name it. Only that quiet, unforgettable sound, the blood on linen, marking the beginning of the end. It is in the air. Everyone feels it, though no one can see it. The invisible weight that hangs in parlours and bedrooms, the faint heaviness in every breath. Londoners begin to suspect that something in the city itself has turned against them. The fog no longer feels like weather, it feels like a warning. Thick and sour, it rolls through alleys and settles in the lungs. The air that once carried gossip, laughter, and prayer now carries something crueler. Doctors speak of miasma, a poisonous vapor that seeps from drains, graveyards, and the rot of the river. They say illness rises with the morning mist and sinks again at night. To fight it, families burn vinegar-soaked rags, wave bunches of herbs through the room, or scatter lavender on the floorboards. Mothers keep bowls of camphor beside the bed, praying the scent will cleanse what they cannot see. Every house smells faintly of medicine and dread, but it isn't the air that poisons, it's the breath that leaves a body and enters another. No one knows this yet. Lovers lean close, whispering through the soft veil of contagion. Children climb into their parents' beds for comfort, inhaling the sickness without a thought. In tenement buildings, a single cough can travel through cracks in the wall, moving from room to room like a ghost with no mercy. The poor breathe one another's air, share the same damp blankets, the same exhaustion. For them, fresh air is a luxury. Windows don't open when they're nailed shut to keep out the cold. And so, the disease spreads not in waves, but in breaths. One person exhales, another inhales. An invisible exchange. In the drawing rooms of the wealthy, the same thing happens only with lace curtains instead of soot. The same thin cough, the same red handkerchief. The air offers no allegiance to class. The city begins to smell different. Coal smoke mixes with the sharpness of carbolic acid and the sickly sweetness of laudanum. Street vendors hawk lung tonics made of molasses and whiskey, while chemists fill bottles with promises. Breathe deep, one advertisement says, strength for the delicate chest. But breathing itself has become an act of risk. The doctors prescribe sea voyages, mountain air, anything far from London's lungs. Families begin to send their sick away to Switzerland, to the southern coast, believing that distance might mean survival. At home, those who stay behind begin to fear the rooms themselves. They throw open windows when the fog allows it, though the winter air bites like ice. Still, they prefer the cold to the thought of invisible death. Curtains flutter, candles flicker, and every breeze feels both salvation and threat. By night, the air grows close again, heavy with coughs and whispers. In the silence between them, the city seems to hold its breath. The same streets that once carried laughter and song now echo with the sound of lungs betraying their owners. The people of London do not yet know the truth that the disease has already chosen its kingdom, and it is the body itself. But they sense it all the same. The air that once sustained them has turned traitor. The enemy is in every breath. It begins as a nuisance, a tickle in the throat that disturbs the night, the kind of cough that feels harmless at first, light and dry, almost polite. A sip of water, a swallow, a moment's pause, and silence returns. But in the morning, it's there again, faint but persistent. By evening, it deepens. By the week's end, it echoes. And soon, it belongs not just to the lungs, but to the house itself. In the early months, those afflicted learn the rhythm of denial. It's the damp, they say, the smoke, the weather. They blame drafts, soot, the city's endless fog. The cough becomes an uninvited guest at the table, cleared throats between sips of tea, muffled spasms behind napkins. A husband apologizes. A mother smiles faintly, promising she's fine. The handkerchief hides what the mouth cannot, but the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. The lungs grow tender, raw as scraped porcelain. Sleep no longer heals, it trembles. Each inhale feels heavier, as though the air itself has thickened. The ribs ache from the force of breathing, the muscles along the spine tighten with every gasp, and still the cough refuses to leave. At night, the sound travels through the walls. In one house, a child coughs in her sleep. In another, an old man coughs into his pillow until the fabric dampens. It becomes the background hum of the city, a thousand throats clearing into the dark. Nurses call it the consumptive chorus, the sound of London learning how to die quietly. Doctors, their patients worn thin, offer advice that borders on superstition. Don't speak after sundown. Walk in the gardens of Hyde Park, but only when the sun is out. Avoid excitement, laughter, sorrow, as if emotion itself were dangerous. And perhaps it is, for a laughing fit can turn to a spasm, and a spasm to a mouthful of blood. The cough feeds on warmth, on joy, on anything that stirs the lungs to life. The safest heart is the still one. For those with means, there are remedies. Cough lozenges of honey and morphine, powders made of opium and chalk, syrups thick as tar. They soothe, but only for a while. The cough always returns, dragging a little more breath away each time. Those without money take to gin, its burn offering a brief illusion of strength. The taverns are filled with the sound of coughing men pretending to laugh. In the tenements, the sound is different, hoarse, desperate, and unending. Mothers hush their children not with lullabies but with handkerchiefs. The air smells of damp wool, salt, sweat, and sickness. There is no privacy in poverty. Every cough is public, every death shared. And yet, the city continues. Carriages clatter, factories roar, bells ring. The world does not pause for the coughing. It only grows louder to drown it out. But those who live with it know its rhythm by heart. The dry rasp that becomes a wet rattle. The sigh that turns to struggle. The breath that catches, then fades. In time, even silence feels suspicious, too still, too kind. For when the cough finally stops, it is not because the body has healed. It is because the body has surrendered. In the parlours of London and Bath, among the oil lamps and velvet drapes, sickness begins to look like fashion. The poets have written their lies too well. Pale skin becomes a mark of refinement, and weakness a whisper of the divine. The most admired women of the age wear their fragility like jewels. Society, drunk on its own sentimentality, mistakes decline for grace. The ladies of lace glide through drawing rooms like apparitions. They move carefully, speaking softly, pausing often to rest one gloved hand against the heart. Their cheeks bloom faintly pink, not from rouge, but from fever. In candlelight, it is difficult to tell the difference. When they cough, they do so delicately, behind folded fans or embroidered handkerchiefs. The red stains left behind are discreetly hidden before the servants enter. Beauty and death have begun to share a mirror. Poets and painters praise them endlessly. They write of eyes bright with heavenly fire, of skin white as lilies touched by fierce morning. Tuberculosis becomes the muse of an empire obsessed with appearances. Every fainting couch, every whispered compliment, every tragic sigh feeds the illusion that suffering is elegant. A woman's frailty becomes her virtue. To look strong is vulgar. To be dying is almost divine. At soirée, the conversation drifts easily between art, gossip, and illness. She has the look, someone might whisper, the beautiful consumption, and the others nod knowingly, as if death were a mark of breeding. They do not speak of the coughing fits in the dark, or the blood that stains the sheets by dawn. In these glittering rooms, death has been powdered and perfumed until it almost seems kind. The fashion follows swiftly. Corsets are drawn tighter to mimic the narrow waists of the dying. Complexions are powdered to an ashen sheen. Women refuse hearty meals, choosing instead to nibble on thin soups and air, cultivating that fragile, translucent look that makes men sigh and artists weep. Magazines praise the ethereal figure and the delicate constitution. No one calls it starvation, they call it taste. Behind closed doors, though, the illusion collapses. The coughing worsens. The fevers burn too long. Husbands stand helpless at the bedsides of wives who once glowed beneath chandeliers. Their beauty remains even as the flesh thins, as collarbones sharpen beneath silk. The poet's muse is dying by inches, and there is no verse that can save her. The servants know the truth. They wash the blood from the linens, carry the bowls of water turned pink, and open the windows when the smell becomes too much. They see the glamour stripped bare, the hollow eyes, the trembling hands, the sound of lungs drowning quietly in their own fragility. Outside, the city celebrates another ball, another portrait unveiled, another poem published in praise of dying youth. But upstairs, in darkened rooms draped in lace, the true fashion of the age reveals itself. The fever burns brighter than any jewel, and in that glow, the line between beauty and death disappears entirely. By morning, the maid will draw the curtains once more. The city will wake to another day of art, progress, and sickness still calling it beauty. He arrives just after dawn, when the streets are still silver with fog, and the city's coughing chorus has not yet risen to full strength. His boots click softly on the cobblestones as he approaches the townhouse door, leather bag in hand. The bag is worn smooth at the corners, polished from years of use. Inside it lie a century's worth of faith, tonics, syrups, powders, and prayers disguised as medicine. The maid opens the door, her eyes lowered. The doctor nods, accustomed to the ritual of discretion. No one wishes the neighbors to know. He removes his hat and steps into a hallway that smells of boiled milk and carbolic. The house is quiet except for the occasional cough from upstairs, long, low, and ragged. He knows that sound too well. It will haunt his dreams long after this visit ends. Up the staircase, portraits line the wall, families smiling, healthy, painted before the age of coughing began. He has seen hundreds of these houses, each with its own ghost behind the curtains. The sickroom door opens to reveal a figure propped on pillows, pale as wax. The room is warm, too warm. A fire glows in the grate, and the air is heavy with lavender water and laudanum. The patient smiles faintly, grateful, expectant. The doctor smiles back. He must. He begins his work with small talk, always small talk. It steadies the patient and hides the truth. He asks about sleep, about appetite, about the weather. Then he listens. The stethoscope, newer now, made of cold metal, presses against the thin fabric of a nightgown. Beneath it, the chest rises and falls with effort. The sound is unmistakable, the soft crackle of lungs drowning in themselves. He closes his eyes, listens again, then straightens. It's only a touch upon the lungs, he says gently. A matter of rest, of strength regained. The mother in the corner exhales, relieved. The patient nods, eyes bright with trust. The doctor reaches for his bag. From it come his instruments of reassurance, tiny glass bottles filled with colored liquids, powders wrapped in paper, spoons that smell faintly of opium and honey. He mixes laudanum with cough syrup, adds a few drops of camphor oil, and instructs the maid to prepare warm milk twice daily. Fresh air, if she can bear it, he says. But only in the morning, and never the damp air after dusk. His words are careful, practiced. He speaks not to cure but to comfort. There is no cure, not yet. Before leaving, he checks the pulse again, light as a thread, barely there. He looks at the girl's face, at the way the fever makes her skin glow like candlelight. He knows she will not see another spring, but he smiles anyway, tips his hat, and promises to return tomorrow. On the street again, he breathes the London air, thick with smoke and the distant rattle of carriage wheels. Behind him, another house waits, another cough, another polite lie. His bag feels heavier each day, though it carries little more than hope. He wonders, not for the first time, which will run out first, the medicine or the mercy to keep pretending it works. In the silence between patients, he allows himself one unspoken prayer, that one day someone might open a bottle in a room like this and find something stronger than comfort inside, something that could stop the coughing, something that could let the world breathe again, high above the choking cities, where the air thins and the world smells faintly of pine and frost. A new idea begins to take shape. If the disease thrives in filth, then perhaps it can be starved in purity. That is the logic behind the sanitarium, those strange palaces of silence built upon mountainsides and by cold, reflective lakes. They rise like temples of air and sunlight, promising what London and Manchester never could: clean breath. The journey to one is half the treatment. Patients travel for days by train, bundled in shawls and blankets, staring out at the grey fields rushing by. Mothers clutch bottles of tonic. Young men carry sketchbooks and books of verse, pretending it's a retreat, not an exile. At each stop, a few more passengers disembark, coughing softly into handkerchiefs. By the time the train reaches the Swiss Alps or the seaside cliffs of Cornwall, it feels more like a procession of ghosts than a holiday. The sanitarium itself is a strange world. Everything here is arranged around air and light. Windows open wide even in winter, and the wind sings through the halls like a living thing. Beds are lined neatly on verandas so patients can sleep outdoors. Faces turn to the pale sun. The doctors believe in the power of cold purity, the cleansing of the lungs through exposure. They say the disease cannot live where the air is clean. The patients shiver and try to believe them. Each day follows the same rhythm: rest, milk, sunlight. At dawn, nurses glide between rows of iron beds, their footsteps muffled by snow. They check pulses, measure temperature, and murmur praise when the fever dips by a fraction. Breakfast is raw eggs beaten into cream, followed by a slow walk if strength allows. Talking is discouraged, laughter forbidden. Breath must be conserved like money, even reading is rationed. The mind, like the body, must be quiet to heal. In the afternoons, the faint sound of piano drifts from the common room. The instrument is always slightly out of tune, but no one complains. It fills the air between the coughs, gives them rhythm. Some patients hum softly, others close their eyes and imagine the world below the city, the river, the faces of those who have already stopped writing letters. When the sun begins to set, the music fades and the silence returns, vast and white as the snow outside. At night, the wind rises, the building creaks. From bed to bed, you can hear the uneven breathing of the living and the stillness of those who are not. The nurses cover the bodies before dawn. By morning, the beds are empty again, ready for new arrivals. And yet, each day, the others rise and walk the verandas, drinking in the air like communion. They tell themselves they are healing. They count the days not by improvement, but by survival. In this place of thin light and thinner hope, the world has been reduced to its simplest exchange. Inhale, exhale, and pray the next breath is still yours. In the drawers of nightstands and the folds of travel trunks, small notebooks begin to appear. Their pages are thin, their bindings fragile, their words written in ink that trembles slightly with each breath. These are the fever diaries, the final voices of a generation that learned to die slowly and write beautifully about it. Patients in sanitariums and sick rooms alike turn to the page when silence becomes unbearable. The world around them has narrowed to a bed, a window, and the faint taste of medicine. Writing becomes a form of breathing, an attempt to trap life on paper before the lungs can no longer hold it. The entries begin with the optimism of the newly diagnosed, feeling stronger today. A walk before the fog. The doctor says rest and milk will make me whole again. By the second week, the tone shifts. The coughing has worsened. The nights are longer now. I dream of rooms with no air. Many of these diaries are never meant to be read. They are whispered confessions between the living and the dying self. A young woman in Brighton describes the sound of her own lungs, like wet paper being torn. A poet in Hampstead writes of counting his heartbeats until he loses track. Another patient, an artist, sketches each day's decline, his own ribs, sharper each morning, his breath painted in faint pencil lines like mist. Visitors often find the notebooks after the rooms are emptied. Mothers trace their children's handwriting with gloved fingers. Lovers fold pages against their hearts, unable to throw them away. Doctors, when they read them, sometimes learn more than medicine ever taught them: what it feels like to drown in air, what courage looks like when it comes in whispers instead of speeches. In these pages, the disease becomes almost sentient. Patients speak to it, reason with it, plead with it. "Not tonight," one entry reads. "Let me see another morning." Others treat it as a companion, my pale friend, my shadow, my mirror. It is both enemy and muse, granting clarity even as it takes everything else. The fever sharpens the mind. The dying often write with startling precision, as though their souls are racing to finish the sentence before breath runs out. The nurses sometimes read them aloud to those too weak to hold a pen. The words, fragile as breath, fill the ward like prayer. For a few minutes, the patients listen not to their own coughing, but to something human, something alive. The diaries turn the sanitarium into a library of ghosts, each page fluttering softly in the alpine wind. When the end comes, the diaries are tucked beneath pillows or tied with ribbon and sent home with the body. Some are buried, others are burned for fear of contagion, but a few survive, passed down quietly, anonymous voices carried through time. If you open one now, the ink has faded to brown, the pages brittle with age, but the words remain clear enough to read. You can almost hear the breath between sentences, the pauses, the effort, the heartbeat under each line, and for a moment you understand what they meant to capture. Not the pain, not even the death, but the desperate, beautiful attempt to keep breathing on the page when the body no longer could. It begins with tenderness, always tenderness. A hand held too long after a fit of coughing, a kiss pressed to a fevered brow, a whisper exchanged across the pillow when both know they should not be so near. In the quiet world of the sick room, love becomes rebellion. The air may be dangerous, but loneliness is worse. And so they lean closer. The doctors warn against it, of course. They speak of breath-borne vapors, of shared atmosphere, but their words are too abstract to fight the pull of the heart. Lovers are not made for distance. The disease is invisible, and what cannot be seen is easily ignored until it isn't. For now, the ill one smiles softly, grateful for company. The healthy one feels brave, noble even, staying when others retreat. In that fragile defiance lies tragedy waiting to bloom. In a small house on the outskirts of Bath, a young woman named Clara coughs into her sleeve while her fiancé reads aloud from a book of poetry. She insists she's recovering, that the sea air has done her good. He nods, though her hands tremble when she lifts her teacup. When she grows tired, he tucks her shawl around her shoulders, unaware that every breath she exhales lingers between them like a secret. The doctor has said little, only that Clara must rest, that she must be kept warm, that she must not be alone. And so the young man stays. Weeks pass, and the fever ebbs and flares. Clara's letters to friends grow shorter, his longer. He describes her pallor as radiant, her frailty as divine. When she dies in early spring, he does not leave the house for days. The neighbors whisper that he is grieving too deeply, but in truth, the cough has already begun in him. By summer, he is pale as she was, coughing into the same kind of handkerchief. Love, it seems, has shared more than memory. Their story is not unique. Across England, Widows nurse, husbands, sisters sit at brothers' bedsides, mothers cradle dying children, and all of them breathe the same air. Tuberculosis is a thief that thrives on devotion. The closer the heart leans, the faster it steals. The disease moves through affection like ink, through cloth, silent, irreversible. It does not punish cruelty or distance, it punishes tenderness. Still, they stay. In boarding houses, in cottages, in hospital wards lined with iron beds, one figure always remains beside another. Some say it's duty, others say it's faith, but most simply cannot bear the sound of a loved one coughing alone. To share breath, even poisoned breath, is to share life for just a little longer. When the second one falls ill, no one is surprised. The doctor closes his notebook with a sigh. Another house will draw its curtains soon. Yet somewhere, in another room, another pair of hands still clasp across the bedsheets, refusing to let go. Because in an age when even air could kill, love remained the one contagion no one wished to cure. And so the white plague spreads, not just through lungs, but through the tenderness of those who stayed too close. There is a smell that follows sickness, a blend of alcohol, sweat, and fading flowers. But in the new hospitals of the Victorian age, it is masked by something sharper. Ether, carbolic acid, pine resin, these are the scents of progress, the perfumes of modern medicine. They cling to the hallways of the sanatoriums and infirmaries, mixing with the echo of footsteps and the low hum of human breath. The physicians call it cleanliness, the nurses call it safety. The patients, lying in narrow beds beneath starched sheets, call it the smell of dying made polite. The hospitals are built to look like hope. High ceilings, whitewashed walls, great windows opened wide to let in the cleansing air. But the air outside is the same air that carries the disease. Inside, the orderlies scrub until their hands crack and bleed. Floors gleam, bedpans shine, and the scent of disinfectant burns the nose. Every surface glistens as though the building itself is trying to deny what happens inside it. Still, the coughing never stops. In one such ward, a young nurse named Agnes moves quietly between rows of iron beds. She has tied a cloth soaked in pine oil around her neck to dull the smell of sickness, but after weeks, she no longer notices it. Her world has become a symphony of small sounds. The clink of spoons, the rasp of coughs, the faint drip of medicine bottles. She carries a tray of cups, filled with dark syrup that promises relief, but rarely delivers it. When she leans close to lift a weakened patient's head, she can feel the heat of their breath against her skin. She knows the danger. Of course they all do, but duty has its own kind of blindness. The doctors sweep through in the mornings, crisp and immaculate, discussing lesions and lesions healing. They take notes, nod gravely, prescribe more tonics. Occasionally one pauses to admire the smell. Ether and pine, he says with satisfaction. The scent of a civilized hospital. Agnes says nothing. She has seen how civility collapses when the night comes and a patient begins to cough blood. She has scrubbed those floors too many times to find comfort in the odor. At dusk, the gas lamps hiss to life, their glow painting long shadows over the white walls. The hospital hums with its nightly routine morphine, measured drop by drop, bedsheets straightened, windows closed against the chill. Somewhere, a patient hums a hymn to himself, a thin thread of sound weaving through the rows of beds. Agnes listens as she folds the day's linens. She will burn them tomorrow, as always. The smell of smoke will mingle with pine, drifting out through the open vents like a prayer. Outside, London continues to choke under its own progress, its air thick with soot and ambition. Inside, ether and pine struggle to rewrite the story, to replace decay with order, despair with sterilized hope. But beneath the antiseptic calm, the truth remains. The hospitals are not sanctuaries. They are way stations, between breath and silence, wrapped in the scent of medicine and the illusion of control. No one in the house spoke of her much, not before and certainly not after. She was one of dozens of young women who came to London for work. her name stitched neatly inside her one good dress. Ellen, they think it was, or perhaps Mary. The family who employed her could not quite recall. They remembered her hands, though always red from washing, always moving, always gentle. She had started coughing in winter, when the frost clung to the inside of the windows and the laundry froze stiff in the yard. At first, it was nothing worth mentioning. The lady of the house told her to wrap her scarf tighter, to drink hot tea before bed, but the cough deepened, echoing through the scullery at night. The other servants began leaving food outside her door, afraid to share the same air. She worked until she couldn't stand, until the coughing left her doubled over the washtub. That was when they sent for the doctor, not for her sake, but because they feared infection. He arrived with his usual bag of bottles and reassurances. He looked at Ellen. Yes, it must have been Ellen lying on her narrow cot, the air damp with steam from the kitchen below. He touched her wrist, listened to her chest, and shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Rest," he said. "Fresh air, if you can manage it." But there was no fresh air to be found in the servants' quarters, and no one thought to move her upstairs. She was given broth, a thin blanket, and silence. When she died 3 nights later, it was quiet enough that no one woke. By morning, the lady of the house instructed that her belongings be burned, and her name struck from the household ledger. The body was wrapped in an old bedsheet and taken by cart to a parish graveyard at the edge of the city. There were no flowers, no hymns. The sexton worked quickly. He had many to bury that week. The funeral lasted less than 10 minutes. The gravedigger muttered a verse, half remembered, half prayer, and lowered her into the earth beside others like her. Thin women from the laundries, girls from the factories, housemaids from fine addresses who had once been called good help. The city was full of such graves, each marked by nothing more than a wooden post that would rot before spring. Back at the townhouse, the windows were opened wide to air out the smell of illness. The family resumed their breakfast routine, the clinking of china echoing faintly through the hall. The lady of the house mentioned to her friends that the maid had succumbed to a weakness of the chest, an unfortunate thing, but hardly uncommon. Another girl would arrive within the week, and so Ellen, or Mary, was forgotten, folded neatly into the city's endless hum. Her death changed nothing, except that the household grew a little quieter at night. The washing was done by another pair of hands. The silver shined just as bright. But somewhere beneath the frost-bitten soil of the parish yard, the cough that killed her continued to echo through London, soft, patient, and hungry for breath. For every mansion with closed curtains, there were 100 such funerals, brief and unseen. The White Plague made no distinction between marble halls and kitchen floors, but it was the maids, the washerwomen, the invisible ones, who filled the ground first, buried not by family, but by history itself. The sound fades slowly, like a candle burning out. Once, the alleys of London were full of it, the laughter of children, the echo of skipping ropes, the shrill rise of nursery rhymes chanted against the rumble of carts. But by the middle of the century, that music began to die away. In its place came the sound of coughing, thin, high, pitiful, carried on the wind from every poor street and orphanage window. The White Plague had found its youngest voices. In the crowded tenements of Bethnal Green and Southwark, the disease spread faster than hunger. The air was always thick there, warm from too many bodies, wet from the wash water that never quite dried. Families of 6 or 8 shared a single room. Infants slept beside windows slick with condensation, their breaths misting the glass like ghostly drawings. Mothers tried to hush their coughing children, pressing rags soaked in vinegar to their mouths, praying the neighbors wouldn't hear. Sickness was shame, even among the poor. It meant weakness, bad luck, or worse, God's displeasure. The workhouses filled with the sound of it. Rows of iron beds lined the wards, each one holding a small figure shivering under a threadbare blanket. Nurses moved quietly, their aprons damp from washing. They wiped blood from the children's lips and whispered comfort that never fooled anyone. Some of the older girls hummed lullabies, the melodies faint and breathless. By nightfall, the songs always stopped. Doctors called it scrofula when it showed in the glands, consumption when it took the lungs, and wasting when it left the body skeletal. To the parents, it was simply the end. They had no names for what took their sons and daughters, only the memory of their silence afterward. Coffins grew smaller each month, and the gravediggers learned to work faster. The city's burial grounds filled with the soft weight of children who had once sung about sunshine and skipping ropes. In better neighborhoods, the brave, same tragedy wore finer clothes. Tutors were dismissed when the first cough began. Windows were opened wide, letting in the cold. Fires were doused to cleanse the air. The family doctor arrived with polished shoes and the smell of tobacco. He would prescribe rest, warm milk, and moderate cheerfulness. When the small bodies began to fail, they were taken to the seaside for airing. Mothers wrapped them in shawls and wheeled them along the promenade, pretending not to count the shallow breaths. Some came home slightly stronger, most did not. And yet, the illusion persisted. Artists painted portraits of angelic children fading away with soft smiles and curls untouched by death. They called them innocents. The newspapers printed sentimental poems about their purity, their peace. But in the streets where their toys still lay abandoned, the truth was not peaceful, it was hollow. By the 1870s, whole schools in the poorest wards had fallen quiet. The games, the songs, the skipping rhymes, all replaced by the rattle of lungs and the heavy footfalls of undertakers. London, for all its progress, had forgotten the sound of children singing. The silence lingered like a held breath, proof that even the smallest voices were not spared from the hunger of the White Plague. By dawn, the air above the East End was already grey. The factory chimneys stretched like black fingers into the low clouds, coughing soot into the sky before the workers even arrived. Each whistle's shriek summoned thousands, men, women, and children marching through the fog to the rhythm of necessity. To live in industrial England was to live by breath alone, and for many, that breath was already poisoned. Inside the spinning mills, the air shimmered with cotton dust. Fibers drifted in the shafts of morning light like snow that never melted, clinging to skin, hair, and lungs. The overseers called it fluff. The workers called it death. The youngest girls, barefoot, sleeves rolled high, ran between machines with quick, practiced grace, brushing away loose threads, their lungs filled with lint until their coughs turned white. No one stopped the machines for coughing. The noise drowned everything. Tuberculosis thrived here as naturally as the machinery. The doctors who visited called the workers' pallor the factory complexion, a thin whiteness tinged with grey. At first, the cough was treated as part of the trade, like a callus or a burn, but soon it became the sound of the shift itself, a ceaseless rhythm between the clatter of gears and the hiss of steam. Workers learned to cough between rotations, to muffle it in rags, to keep the foreman from noticing. Those who collapsed were carried out to the yard and replaced before the machine cooled. The air was worst in the foundries. There the dust was black and metallic, heavier than air, settling in the chest until every breath scraped like sandpaper. Smelters' lungs, they called it, until the same doctors began finding the telltale lesions of tuberculosis in the dead. In the match factories, the fumes of phosphorus lit more than candles. They ignited the disease, feeding it through heat and hunger. The White Plague, it seemed, was not a punishment but an industry itself, one that fed on labor. The employers issued pamphlets about moral hygiene. They spoke of fresh air and virtue, not wages and ventilation. The solution, they said, was temperance, prayer, and hard work. Meanwhile, their profits climbed, and the workers' lungs failed. The hospitals near the factory districts overflowed. Charitable societies tried to intervene, sending clean sheets, building convalescent homes. But there were too many bodies, too many names to remember. At sunset, the workers trudged home beneath the same sky that had blackened their lungs. The river gleamed dully, carrying away the soot but not the sickness. In the narrow tenements nearby, wives boiled rags for their husbands' chests. The air inside those rooms was no better than the air outside. Children slept to the lullaby of coughing parents, already inheriting the rhythm that would one day claim them too. By the turn of the century, reformers would write about the diseases of progress, about how industry had traded clean air for prosperity. But for the millions who lived and died within those walls, there was no progress, only the slow, grinding labor of breathing. The factory was more than a place of work. It was an altar to the age of smoke, and its god demanded a terrible offering, lungs in exchange for bread. He carries it beneath his waistcoat, hidden behind the polite armor of good breeding. In the mirror, the symptoms are easy to disguise: a bit of rouge on the cheeks, a touch of powder along the jaw, and the illusion of health returns. But when he removes his collar at night, when the candlelight falls across his ribs, the truth shows through. The weight lost, the breath that stumbles, the faint pink stain on his handkerchief. The gentlemen of Victorian England are not supposed to be ill. Illness is an inconvenience, not a confession. They are the empire's backbone: bankers, barristers, parliamentarians, men whose health is assumed, whose vitality underpins their authority. Yet even among them, the White Plague makes no exceptions. In clubs lined with oak and cigar smoke, they cough discreetly into linen squares, their eyes watering as the others pretend not to notice. The cough is a small betrayal, a flaw in the performance of strength. For many, it begins during the long hours, at the desk. The city's air is thick, the windows closed against the smog, and the lungs begin to ache. When the doctor is finally called, he speaks in euphemisms: a delicate constitution, a chest complaint, an exhaustion of the spirits. The patient nods gravely, thankful for the discretion. In polite society, consumption is not discussed. To name it is to invite its shadow into the room. So he works on. He attends dinners, keeps appointments, and walks through the parks with a cane and a measured pace. When the coughing fits come, he excuses himself, locking the door before the fit overtakes him. On his desk lie letters from business partners in India, receipts from factories in Manchester, and a medical bill carefully hidden beneath them. Empire and illness share the same ink. His wife watches silently. She knows the meaning of the stains she scrubs from his collars. She knows the nights when he wakes gasping, the hand pressed hard against his chest as though to hold his breath inside. But she also knows what must never be said aloud. Their children are still in school. Their household depends on appearances. In a world where weakness is shame, love becomes a quiet act of concealment. At the gentleman's club, there is gossip always couched in sympathy. Poor fellow, overworked. He's gone to the coast to recover. The climate, you know, it's murder on the lungs. No one says the word. Yet when he fails to return after winter, his absence is explained with a shrug and a lowered voice. A decline, they murmur. Peaceful. And so, the illness continues its work in silence. The servants burn the sheets, the doctor signs the certificate, and the obituaries speak of dedication, of service, of a man who gave too much to his work. No mention of the blood, or the nights spent gasping for air. In the end, tuberculosis claims him as gently as it claimed the poor, though the world will remember him differently. His death, like his life, is polished, respectable, contained. In the great ledgers of empire, he will be marked as one more loss to exhaustion, to stress, to the demands of progress. But in truth, he was undone not by duty nor ambition, but by the same invisible air that moves through every class, every home, every lung, the White Plague, indifferent to wealth, yet perfectly at home behind silk curtains. The first thing they did was close the door. Not gently, not cruelly, just firmly, with the sound of finality that only wood and brass can make. A small latch clicked, and the house adjusted around the new rule: one room for the sick, the rest for the living. The air that once flowed freely through the halls was now divided, measured, and feared. Before this age of sickness, families slept close. Parents and children shared chambers, warmth, breath, and dreams. But the plague of the lungs rewrote those intimacies. Doctors began to whisper the word isolation. It carried a kind of authority, scientific, modern, merciful, but in truth, it meant separation. It meant loneliness. It meant a room where the door stayed shut, even when the coughing turned to silence. In London's finer houses, isolation became an art of appearances. The sick room was kept immaculate. Clean sheets, pale curtains, and flowers changed daily to disguise the smell of decay. A chair stood by the bed for visitors who rarely stayed long. Conversation was brief, affection restrained. The healthy wore gloves or scarves dipped in camphor, as if politeness could shield them from contagion. When the coughing grew violent, guests withdrew, murmuring that the patient must rest. The door closed again. In poorer homes, isolation was impossible. 10 people might share 2 rooms, their breaths mingling no matter how many windows they opened. A mother would hang a sheet across a corner of the room and call it protection. But the disease paid no mind to cotton. It passed through fabric, through walls, through love itself. Still, she would whisper to the others, "Don't touch him, don't go near," and then cradle the coughing child until morning. Hospitals took the word isolation further. The wards for the consumptive were set apart from the others, down quiet corridors where even the nurses walked more softly. Windows were nailed open to let in air. Visitors signed their names in ledgers, as if entering another world. Inside, the patients lay in rows, some reading, some writing, some staring at the ceiling. They were told it was for their safety, but they knew better. Isolation was not for the dying, it was for the living. It was the city's attempt to wall off fear. For the patient, the days stretched endlessly. Meals arrived on trays left by the door. Voices came muffled through the walls. The world beyond, the window street, vendors, horse carts, children's laughter, became something remembered rather than lived. In the long afternoons, the sunlight moved slowly across the floorboards, marking the passage of hours more faithfully than any clock. And when death finally came, it came quietly. The door opened one last time, only for the doctor and the undertaker. The room was emptied, washed, and sealed again. For a day or two, the smell of ether lingered in the hallway. Then life continued. Isolation had been invented first as medicine, then as habit. It would outlive the plague that birthed it. For in every home, from the grandest townhouse to the narrowest alley, people had learned a new truth. Sometimes survival means keeping the living apart from the dying, even when both still long for the same air. It waits each morning, beading faintly with condensation a glass of milk, cold from the pantry, sitting on the bedside table beside a folded cloth and a spoon. It has become part of the ritual now, as essential as prayer. The doctor said that milk restores strength, builds the blood, keeps the lungs soft. The nurses at the sanitarium say it with conviction: drink your milk, breathe your air, and believe. For the consumptive, the day begins and ends with these small commandments. At sunrise, the first glass arrives thick, sweet, and heavy with cream. It coats the throat like medicine and settles uneasily in a stomach that has forgotten hunger. Then comes the broth, the eggs, the second glass. Each swallow is an act of faith, a defiance against the slow starvation of the body. When appetite fades, the attendants coax, one more sip, for strength. Milk becomes a language of hope. It stands for nourishment, purity, new life, the opposite of what the illness takes. It smells of the countryside, of safety, of childhood before the coughing began. In sanitariums, milk deliveries arrive before dawn, glass bottles clinking like soft bells in the fog. Cows graze in the fields beyond the wards, tended with the same reverence as the patients themselves. The milk is life, the doctors say. The milk is clean, but the milk is not always clean. Unknown to them, the same white fluid that sustains can also carry the invisible enemy. Tuberculosis lives in the udders of infected cows, slips quietly into the milk, and finds new lungs to haunt. The glass of salvation becomes a glass of contagion. No one knows yet. They believe in its healing because they must. In an age without cure, faith becomes science's twin. In drawing rooms across London, invalids sip milk from porcelain cups rimmed in gold. In workhouses, children line up for tin mugs filled to the brim, the overseer watching, to be sure no one wastes a drop. In both places, the same promise is spoken: drink and grow strong. And in both, the same cough continues through the night. At home, mothers measure the hours between doses. They warm the milk with sugar and whisper encouragement to their pale sons and daughters. It will make you better, they say, though their voices betray the tremor of doubt. They watch each mouthful swallowed as though it were a charm against death. Sometimes the glass remains half full by morning, the surface still, the reflection of a candle flickering in its white depths. The doctors record small improvements, color returning, strength regained, but the truth is more complicated. Milk buys time, not health. It softens the decline, smooths the edges of suffering. It gives the illusion of progress in a world too desperate for proof. And so, the glass remains, every morning, every night, cold, white, waiting. It is more than nourishment now, it is symbol, superstition, and ritual all at once. The sick reach for it because it's something to hold, something to believe in when breath and faith grow thin. In an age when medicine could offer only comfort, the glass of milk by the bed became a quiet prayer, the last simple hope that the body might still remember how to live. The room smells of turpentine and damp linen. Canvas leans against the walls in uneven stacks, unfinished faces, faint outlines of landscapes left to dry and gather dust. In the corner, the painter sits by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he tries to steady his hand. Outside, London glimmers faintly through the morning mist. Inside, the light has grown pale, thin as milk. He once painted for the salons for patrons who demanded angels and heroines, cherubs and virtue. But lately, his work has turned inward. He paints what he sees in the mirror. The deepening shadows beneath his eyes, the fever in his cheeks, the pallor spreading down his neck like frost. His hands tremble when he lifts the brush. Each stroke feels heavier, slower, more precious. He knows that this will be the last one he finishes. The disease has taken up residence in his lungs, whispering softly as he works. Every cough shakes the easel. Every breath tastes of copper and dust. Yet the urge to create remains, fiercer than before. To paint is to defy the fading, to leave behind proof that he was more than an illness, more than the slow unraveling of his own body. His model sits quietly nearby, his wife perhaps, or a friend too loyal to leave. Her dress rustles faintly as she adjusts her pose, but her eyes keep straying to him. She sees the sweat at his temples, the streak of red on his handkerchief, the way he pauses mid-breath. "Rest," she whispers. He shakes his head. There is no time for rest. The portrait takes form in slow, delicate layers. A woman in white against a dark background, her face calm, luminous, her gaze turned slightly away as if listening for something distant. The painter studies her, but what he paints is not her face. It is her stillness, her silence, the living echo of what he is losing. When the light begins to fade, he stops and leans back. The brush slips from his fingers. The sound of it hitting the floor seems louder than it should be. He looks at the painting one last time. It is unfinished, but somehow complete, his final statement rendered in oil and breath. In it, the colors shimmer faintly, as though the air itself were alive. That night, the fever rises. The coughing fits come faster, tearing through the quiet like the clatter of broken glass. In the early hours, the lamp burns low, casting the half-finished canvas in a ghostly glow. When the model returns in the morning, she finds him still in his chair, the paintbrush lying across his lap, his eyes open toward the light. They say later that the painting glowed strangely in the gallery, that the face seemed to breathe when the sun struck it just right. Critics praised its serenity, its ethereal melancholy. No one mentioned the blood hidden beneath the varnish, or the trembling hand that had painted it. The world remembered him as a romantic, another artist claimed by the beautiful death. But in truth, there was nothing beautiful about it. Only the quiet desperation of a man trying to leave a piece of himself behind before the white plague took what little air he had left. The chandeliers were already burning when the first cough broke the hush. It was a single, delicate sound, barely noticed beneath the rustle of silk and the tuning of strings, but it carried through the hall like a warning. The audience glanced about, fans fluttering, whispers rising, then faded again beneath the swell of the overture. No one wished to ruin an evening of Verdi for a mere tickle in the throat. The opera house on Covent Garden glittered that night, a beacon of everything London wanted to believe about itself, cultured, invincible, untouched by the sickness that haunted its streets. Outside, the fog curled around the carriages, thick with the stench of coal and death. But inside, the air was perfumed with roses, wax, and expectation. The orchestra began, and the crowd leaned forward as one body. On stage, the soprano took her place beneath the lights. Her gown shimmered like frost, her voice bright and unbroken at first. She sang of love and loss, of parting and reunion, and the audience listened with the rapture of those who cannot imagine dying. But as the aria rose, a strange sound crept into her tone, a faint hitch, a breath that trembled too long before the next note. Her hand came to her chest. A pause. The conductor's baton froze mid-air. Then it happened, a soft, wet gasp. A cough, red blooming against a lace handkerchief. The note died in her throat. For a moment, she stood perfectly still under the lights, pale as marble, eyes wide as if she'd seen herself reflected in the silence. The audience did not move. A woman in the front row fainted. The orchestra lowered their instruments one by one. The curtain came down quickly, but not quickly enough. The whispers rippled outward, a murmur swelling like a tide. Consumption. The words spread through the boxes, the stalls, the lobby. By morning, the newspapers would print it in headlines: opera star struck down mid-performance. They would call it tragic, poetic, divine. But those who had been there knew better. They had seen the sickness made flesh, had watched the white plague claim its victim not in shadow, but in candlelight, before the eyes of the city's most elegant witnesses. In the days that followed, the opera closed its doors. The stagehands washed the boards with vinegar. The costumes were burned. The managers issued statements about renovations and repairs, but everyone knew the truth. The disease had crossed the threshold of art. It had taken something pure and made it mortal. Other singers refused to perform. The great halls fell quiet, their chandeliers dark. For months, the musicians scattered to the countryside, to Paris, to silence. The newspapers turned the soprano into myth, her death recited in drawing rooms like a legend of beauty too fragile for the world. Yet those who had seen her last note die in her throat remembered not beauty, but terror. They remembered how the sound of music had turned to the sound of breath, how the stage, once a place of immortality, had become a mirror for the city itself, gilded, gaslit, and dying quietly from within. That night, London learned that even art could catch its breath and falter, and when the final echoes of applause faded into the cold, there was only silence, thick, uneasy, and absolute. The wedding dress still hangs in the wardrobe, its silk gone yellow around the edges, its veil folded like a memory. It was never worn, not truly. The seamstress finished it in the spring of 1871. The same week, the coughing began. The bride-to-be, her name lost to the years, though her letters signed simply Eleanor, had dreamed of lace from Antwerp, of white roses, of a church filled with music and light. Instead, she married her illness before she could marry her love. Eleanor's family lived on a quiet street in Kensington, where the carriages passed softly, and every house smelled faintly of polish and pride. Her fiancé, a barrister with dark hair and kind eyes, visited daily, bringing letters and books and tulips wrapped in paper. When her cough began, he thought little of it. She'd always been delicate, the sort of woman whose beauty seemed too fine for the world. The doctor, polite and grave, recommended rest. No excitement, no stress. The wedding may be postponed a few weeks, he said. But the few weeks became months, and the months became silence. By summer, she was confined to her room. The windows were opened wide for air, the curtains pinned back to let in sunlight she could no longer feel. The dress hung across the chair by the mirror, a ghostly shape that watched her sleep. The invitations, already printed, were quietly burned by her mother one evening after supper. The fiancé still came, though less often at first because of propriety, later because of fear. The doctor's warnings had grown sterner. It is contagious. The family, desperate to protect their name, began to keep visitors away. Eleanor understood. She smiled when he sent letters instead of calling. "It is better this way," she wrote back in careful ink. "You will remember me as I was, not as I am." She sealed the letter with a petal from the bouquet that had long since wilted in the vase beside her bed. Each day, she grew lighter, more transparent, as though the air were gently unmaking her. Her maid brushed her hair, though it fell out in strands. Her mother read the Psalms aloud, but even scripture sounded far away. In September, when the leaves began to fall, Eleanor asked for her dress. The maid protested, but she insisted. "I wish to see it once more," she whispered. They laid it across the bed, the lace spilling like frost across the coverlet. She ran her fingers over the embroidery, tracing each thread as though memorizing it. "It is beautiful," she said, her voice barely more than breath. "It will do." She died that night, her hand resting on the veil. The fiancé never married. He kept her photograph on his desk until his own death 20 years later. The dress was packed away, its fabric still carrying the faint scent of roses and ether. They say the window of her room was left open that winter, just a crack, as though the house itself still waited for her to walk through the door in white. But the door never opened, and the carriage never came. The bride who never left the house had taken her vows in silence to sickness, to stillness, and to the air that refused to let her go. They arrived tied with blue ribbon, their corners soft from passing through too many hands. The handwriting is careful, slanted, deliberate, a little shaky but still elegant. Each envelope smells faintly of disinfectant and pine. The postmark reads simply Davos, or Ventnor, or Llanfairfychan, the quiet outposts where the sick are sent to breathe. The letters are the last tether between two worlds, the living and the waiting. At the sanatorium, time moves differently. Each day begins with the sound of windows opening to the mountain air, and ends with the sound of coughing echoing through long corridors. The patients are instructed to rest and write. It is good for the mind, the doctors say, and the families like to hear from you. So they do by the hundreds, their words fluttering down the postal routes of Europe like migrating birds. "My dearest Anna," one letter begins, "the air here is sharp as glass, but the doctor says it is full of health. I sleep outdoors, beneath thick blankets, and when I wake, the frost on the railing looks like lace. My lungs feel clearer in the mornings, though by night I cough again. Still, I have hope. Tell father not to worry." Another, "They say the snow will come soon. I have been told to stay until spring. I miss the sound of the river by our house. Here, the only sound is the wind." The families at home read each one as if it were scripture. Mothers traced the words with trembling fingers, hearing the echo of their children's voices in every line. Sweethearts keep them in drawers beside pressed flowers and lockets of hair, pretending that paper and ink can substitute for breath and touch. For the senders, the letters are an illusion of control. If the words can still flow, perhaps the life behind them can too. But as the weeks pass, the handwriting changes. The loops grow uneven, the ink grows faint. Sentences shorten. "I am tired, but better," they write, though both are untrue. Sometimes the letters stop altogether. When they do, the silence that replaces them is louder than any confession. At the sanatorium, the nurses collect the unfinished drafts from the bedside tables. Some are addressed, some not. They fold them gently, unsure what to do. To send them feels cruel. To destroy them feels sacrilegious. So they slip them into drawers or beneath mattresses, hidden from the living but too heavy for the dead to keep. Months later, the families will receive the official notice written in the same careful hand but by someone else. Your son passed peacefully at dawn. Your daughter's strength failed in the night. The final letter is not sealed with love, but with a hospital stamp and a line that reads, "Remains to follow." The surviving letters, the ones that reach their homes, outlive their writers by decades. They rest in attics and trunks, still smelling faintly of ether and mountain frost. When read aloud today, the words seem to breathe again. Fragile, brave, unfinished. They are not just messages, they are monuments in ink. Proof that even as lungs collapsed, voices refused to. In the silence of the sanatoriums, these letters were the only thing that still moved freely. The last whispers of those who tried, word by word, to write themselves home. Paris, they said, could heal anything. It was the city of light, of art, of rebirth, where painters found inspiration, lovers found eternity, and the sick were promised recovery. In the 1880s, carriages rolled daily through the iron gates of its fashionable clinics, carrying men and women from every corner of Europe. The White Plague had made patients of poets and heiresses alike, and now it sent them chasing health across borders, following the whispers of miracle doctors who claimed to have found the cure. The most famous of these establishments sat on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, its facade of limestone bright as bone beneath the Parisian sun. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ozone and antiseptic. Patients reclined in wicker chairs along wide balconies, their faces turned upward toward the filtered light. The physicians in crisp coats moved among them with the gravity of priests. They promised not salvation but transformation, a re-education of the body through science and discipline. "Here," they said, "we teach the lungs to live again." The treatment was precise, almost ritualistic. Every hour had its command. Breathe, rest, walk, eat. Meals were heavy with cream and eggs. The air was measured in degrees of purity. A bell rang for breathing exercises, another for sun baths. The patients stood in rows before tall windows, inhaling in unison, counting aloud in French. To an outsider, it might have looked like a prayer meeting. Among them sat Elise Delaunay, a pianist from Lyon, her fingers now too weak to play. She had arrived in Paris on her father's insistence, thin as paper and coughing blood. "You will be well," he had said. "In Paris, one always is." But weeks passed, and the sickness did not lift. The doctors praised her progress, the color returning, the lungs clearing. But Elise knew better. The color was fever, the clarity was exhaustion. Still, the city itself seemed unwilling to let her die. On the days she could stand, she walked slowly along the Seine, her parasol trembling in the breeze. The world glittered sunlight flashing off shop windows, children running beneath the plane trees, lovers laughing by the water. She tried to absorb it all, to breathe in Paris as though it were medicine, but every inhale burned. By autumn, her letters home spoke more of beauty than of health. "There is music everywhere," she wrote. "Even the carriages sound like violins. If I must die, at least it will be in a city that sings." When she passed in November, the clinic announced it quietly, another name in the register. The nurses washed her room, changed the sheets, and prepared the bed for the next hopeful arrival. The Paris cure continued for decades, its methods refined, its patients uncounted. Some improved for a season, some died within days, but all believed. The city sold them that belief as deftly as it sold perfume or poetry. For the wealthy, death in Paris was almost fashionable, refined, civilized, even enviable. Long after the clinics closed, their balconies stood empty, vines crawling up the stone walls where once people had leaned to catch their breath. Today, the buildings house cafes and apartments. But on quiet afternoons, when the sun hits the windows just so, one might imagine the faint rustle of wicker chairs and the echo of soft, synchronized breathing. The last sighs of those who came to Paris not to live, but to hope. At the edge of the city, where the fog thickens and the cobblestones give way to mud, stands a building few speak of by name. Its walls are tall and grey, its windows barred not for punishment, but for pity. This is where the unwanted sickness goes, the poorhouse infirmary, the final station for those whose lungs have become too heavy for labour, too costly for care. The entrance smells of bleach and boiled cabbage. Inside, the air is a stew of odours, disinfectant, sweat and despair. The corridors echo with the shuffling of feet and the wet, hollow sound of coughing. Beds line the walls, close enough for the dying to feel one another's breath. There are no curtains here, no privacy. The poorhouse does not believe in solitude, it believes in survival, until even that fails. Those who arrive have already been erased from the city above. Seamstresses, dock workers, chimney sweeps, the nameless and the unclaimed. Some are brought by neighbours, others by the police who find them slumped in alleys or curled beneath bridges. They are stripped, washed, and placed beneath coarse wool blankets that itch against the skin. Rest now, the nurse says, though rest is a word that no longer means sleep, it means waiting. In the day ward, sunlight leaks through cracked panes, illuminating dust that dances like snow. The patients watch it drift and wonder if this is what it feels like to leave one's body. Conversation is rare. The weak do not waste air on words. Those who can still talk speak softly of food, of the sea, of home, each memory shaped by distance. One man dreams of Yorkshire moors. A woman recalls the taste of apples she picked as a child. The rest cough until their throats bleed. The nurses are weary, their hands raw from scrubbing, their eyes rimmed in red. They know every face will change by month's end. They work without pause, washing sheets, turning bodies, spooning broth into mouths too tired to swallow. Sometimes, when a patient dies in the night, they leave the body until morning, simply pulling a sheet over the face. There are too many to keep count. Outside, the world does not stop. The factories whistle, the carriages rattle, the fine houses dine by candlelight. The poorhouse remains invisible, its windows glowing faintly in the dark like watchful eyes. The newspapers print poems about the tender decline of consumptive maidens, but say nothing of the hundreds buried without names each week. In the ledgers of the infirmary, they are recorded only by number. Male, age unknown. Cause, pulmonary wasting. Female, domestic servant. Cause, same. On Sundays, the priest visits to murmur prayers over the ward. His voice trembles with the effort of speaking through the smell. He tells them of heaven, of rest, of eternal light. No one answers. Some are already beyond hearing, others have grown skeptical of promises. At dusk, when the lamps flicker, the coughing quiets for a while. The nurses open a window to let the air out, though the fog outside is no kinder. The bodies are wheeled away one by one, and clean sheets are laid for the next to come. The cycle repeats, soft as breathing, endless as the city's hunger. They call it charity, but in truth, it is a warehouse of lungs, a place where the poor are permitted to die indoors. The poorhouse of breath, where hope costs nothing, and air itself is rationed. The drawing room was spotless, as it always had been. The silver gleamed, the piano stood silent, and not a single chair was out of place. But the scent of camphor and vinegar clung faintly to the air, betraying what the family worked so hard to conceal. Upstairs, behind a closed door, someone was dying. Downstairs, guests were served tea in delicate cups, the conversation careful, steady, and utterly false. Respectability was the shield of the Victorian home, polished daily and displayed like an heirloom. To appear untroubled was to survive. Illness could be endured, but scandal could not. And tuberculosis, with its wasting limbs and red-stained linen, carried more shame than sin. It was whispered to be hereditary, the mark of weakness or worse moral failure. The poor might die of filth, the rich, it was said, died of their secrets, so they hid it. When the first cough began, it was explained away. A touch of the lungs, the mother would say, just fatigue. Visitors were reassured, servants instructed to speak of it as a minor indisposition. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual, not for modesty but to hide the glow of a sick-room lamp from the street. Doctors entered discreetly through side doors. When they left, the family spoke of them as friends of fathers. The patient, most often a daughter or wife, was kept upstairs, attended by a nurse whose silence was paid for as carefully as her service. Letters to friends were dictated but never signed. In photographs, the family posed together, the ill one conspicuously absent. The picture smiled on, untarnished. Outside, society rewarded their efforts. Invitations continued to arrive. Donations to charity were noted in the papers. Neighbors admired the family's strength during a difficult season. They could not know that upstairs, the air smelled of decay, and the hand on the bedsheet trembled too weakly to lift a glass. Sometimes the pretense wavered. When the coughing grew too loud, servants blamed the chimney. When the bleeding began, they burned the linens at dawn. The household lived in two worlds, one of polished civility, one of desperate denial, each dependent on the other. For the Victorians, respectability was not merely appearance, it was identity. To lose it was to fall into chaos. Families ruined by illness often vanished from society as though erased, their homes sold, their names spoken in past tense. The disease was cruel, but exposure was worse. Better to die unseen than live in disgrace. And so, when death came, as it always did, it came quietly. The funeral notice would read simply, "After a brief illness," no mention of tuberculosis, of the coughing, of the years of secrecy. The mourners wore black, but their composure was immaculate. Behind the church doors, tears were allowed. Beyond them, only dignity. By night, when the guests had gone, the mother would walk through the now silent sick room. She would touch the windowsill, still cool from months of open air, and the dresser where the medicine bottles had stood. She would gather what little remained, a hairbrush, a book, a shawl, and place them in a chest to be locked away. Tomorrow, the servants would scrub the floors and wash the walls with lime water. By next week, the curtains would be opened again. The house would look untouched, the family restored. Respectability, like the plague itself, had survived another season, clean, unblemished, and silent as breath. Even in winter, the window stayed open. It was the doctor's order, written in neat, unshakable script, pure air at all hours. The patient's mother protested at first. How could she let the freezing wind into her daughter's room? But the doctor's face was firm, and his words were backed by science. Or what passed for it then? The air, he said, must circulate. It must be clean, untainted, free. And so, the room was never closed. Even when frost rimmed the glass, even when snowflakes drifted in and melted on the sill, the curtains were tied back with ribbon, and the fire burned low to compensate for the constant draught. The smell of coal and cold iron mixed with lavender and medicine. Each breath that left the patient's lips turned to mist before vanishing into the endless grey of the London sky. She was 17, the kind of pale the poets loved, thin wrists, luminous skin, eyes that looked perpetually astonished by the world. Her name was Margaret, though her family rarely spoke it aloud anymore. The house itself seemed to whisper it when the wind passed through. Her bed was placed directly beside the window, so she could look out at the world she could no longer touch. The garden below, the street, the occasional passerby wrapped in heavy coats, all reminders that life continued somewhere else. Each morning, her mother would place a bowl of warm milk on the table, sometimes with a flower beside it. Then she would pull the blankets tighter around her daughter's shoulders, fuss with the pillows, and leave the room quickly before her eyes betrayed her. From the hallway, she would pause and listen. If she heard the cough, she would keep walking. If she didn't, she would stop and hold her breath, waiting for it to return. Margaret had grown used to the cold. She no longer flinched when the wind pressed through the room. "It keeps me awake," she would say, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. "It reminds me I'm still here." She wrote letters, that she never sent notes about the color of the sky, the shape of the clouds, the smell of the air when rain was coming. She believed that someday, when she recovered, she would read them all and laugh at her own foolishness. But recovery never came. By spring, the cough had grown deeper, the blood brighter, the window stayed open, even on the day she died, as if the air might coax her back. The curtains billowed gently in the breeze, brushing against her still hand. Her mother entered and closed her eyes before looking at the bed. The first thing she did was shut the window. For a moment, the room filled with warmth again, as if time itself had paused to take one final breath. Later, when the undertaker came, he reopened it. "For the air," he murmured, repeating the doctor's words. The cold wind swept in once more, carrying with it the faint scent of spring. From that day forward, no one in the house could bear to sit near an open window. The very sound of one creaking made their throats tighten. But somewhere, high above the rooftops, the air moved freely again, indifferent, eternal, and empty of all the lives it had taken in its quest to be clean. In the mornings, the milkman's cart rattles through the fog, its wheels leaving pale grooves in the wet cobblestones. The bottles clink softly, glass against glass, a music Londoners trust more than church bells. To most, that sound means health, warm milk for children, cream for tea, strength for the convalescent. But by the late 19th century, the same comfort that soothed the sick had begun to carry death in its white disguise. In an age before pasteurization, milk was taken directly from the cow to the table, believed to be nature's purest offering. Yet nature had grown sick. The dairies of London, small, overcrowded sheds behind taverns and tenements, were nothing like the green pastures imagined by the advertisements. Cows were kept in darkness, knee-deep in filth, fed on brewery waste instead of grass. They coughed too, their ribs showing, their milk thin and streaked with blood. The farmers knew, but poverty does not allow morality. A sick cow was still a working cow, and her milk still found its way into the city's bottles. The same bacterium that hollowed out human lungs lived easily in the cow's udders. It slipped unseen into the morning's delivery, waiting in the cool of the bottle for the next meal. Infants drank it first. Mothers spooned it into their porridge. The poorhouse wards, already full of coughs, filled faster still. But no one suspected the milk. It was the one thing everyone shared, the only nourishment left untainted by class. Doctors noticed, slowly. At first, the cases puzzled them. Children who had never left the nursery were dying of the same wasting as their mothers. Their spines bent, their eyes hollowed, their bodies shrinking as if consumed from within. The physicians blamed bad air, bad habits, moral weakness, everything except the breakfast table. Even when a few curious minds suggested that the milk itself might carry the disease, they were dismissed. "Absurd," wrote one critic. "Milk is the essence of purity." It was not until the 1890s that the truth began to seep out, like the infection it described. Robert Koch's discovery of the tubercle bacillus years earlier had changed everything. When veterinarians examined dairy herds with microscopes newly capable of seeing what had once been invisible, they found the same tiny, deadly rods swimming in the milk. But the revelation came too late for thousands. By then, consumption had already claimed generations of London's children. Even after the discovery, change was slow. Pasteurization was expensive, reform was inconvenient. The wealthy installed filters, boiled their milk, hired private dairies. The poor had no such options. They still lined up with empty pails, trusting the same delivery boys whose bottles gleamed like salvation in the morning mist. One winter, a social reformer named Florence Hill wrote in her diary, "We pour death into the mouths of babes and call it nourishment." Her words went largely unread. Eventually, laws were passed. The cows were inspected, the dairies cleaned, and the milk boiled until it lost its sweetness. But the memory remained. Mothers flinched at the sight of the bottle, and the taste of milk was never quite innocent again. The White Plague had hidden itself in the most human of rituals, the giving of sustenance, and when it was discovered, the city learned one of its darkest truths. that even the act of nurturing could carry death, and that purity itself was never to be trusted. For centuries, disease had been invisible and therefore divine. Illness was the hand of God, or the curse of air, or the punishment of vice. Doctors could chart its course, poets could describe its cruelty, but no one could see it. The sick room was a battlefield fought in blindness. Until one day, a man peered through glass and saw the enemy. It began not in London, but in a German laboratory thick with smoke and silence. The year was 1882, and the man was Robert Koch, a country physician turned scientist whose hands had learned more from microscopes than from patients. He spent his days surrounded by glass slides, jars of agar, and cultures of disease that bloomed like strange, lethal gardens. On one such afternoon, he took a small sample from the lung of a cow that had died of consumption and placed it beneath his lens. What he saw was not mist or spirit, but minute rods, precise and gleaming, pulsing faintly in the light. He stained them red with a chemical dye, and there they were again, countless, identical, relentless. They were alive, and they were everywhere. He named them Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the germ of the White Plague. The announcement, when it came, shattered medicine's long-held myths. Koch's paper, modest, methodical, devastating, spread across Europe like fire. Illness was no longer fate, nor air, nor divine punishment. It was a creature, a living thing that could be hunted. The newspapers called it the revelation of the invisible. For the first time in history, the enemy had a face. In the lecture halls of London, disbelief met wonder. Some hailed it as heresy, others as salvation. The physicians who had sworn by miasma, by the corrupt air of the cities, scoffed at the idea that death could hide in something too small to see. Yet within a decade, the evidence grew undeniable. Germ theory rewrote the rules of existence. The world was alive in ways it had never imagined. Every breath, every touch, every drop of water teeming with unseen life. For tuberculosis, the revelation changed everything and nothing. The disease had been named, but not defeated. Patients still died in their thousands. Hospitals began sterilizing instruments, boiling linens, and opening windows wider than ever. But the coughing continued. Koch himself believed that now that the germ was known, the cure was within reach. He experimented tirelessly, injecting, isolating, inoculating, until one day he claimed to have found it, tuberculin, a serum that would stop the disease in its tracks. For a few dazzling months, the world believed him. Sanatoriums prepared for celebrations. Patients lined up for injections. Politicians praised him as a savior. Then the deaths began again. The serum failed. Hope dissolved. Koch retreated into silence, discredited, his discovery tarnished by disappointment. And yet, the truth he revealed endured. Germ theory became the foundation of modern medicine. It stripped death of its divinity and replaced mystery with biology. It told humanity that disease was not punishment, but presence, that salvation would come not from prayer, but from patience and proof. In the quiet wards of London, the nurses whispered his name with cautious gratitude. They still burned the sheets and opened the windows, but now they understood why. The plague had a body. The air had teeth. And for the first time in centuries, the world could see the monster that had been breathing beside it all along. The year was 1861 when the sound first echoed through the gilded halls of Windsor Castle, a sharp, dry cough that interrupted the rustle of silks and the scratching of pens. It came from the Prince Consort himself, Albert, the steadfast husband of Queen Victoria, a man so precise and disciplined that even illness seemed out of character for him. The court dismissed it at first, calling it a chill, a result of his long rides in the cold. But the cough persisted, deepened, and began to carry with it that faint, unmistakable rattle of the lungs. The empire watched their royal family as a mirror of moral perfection. If Victoria was the mother of the nation, Albert was its conscience, the embodiment of hard work, virtue, and restraint. Yet even he, with all the comforts of science and wealth, was not beyond the reach of the White Plague. The newspapers never dared to name it. Instead, they spoke of a low fever, a decline of strength, a nervous exhaustion. Those who knew the truth whispered it behind lace fans and drawn curtains. Consumption, that most democratic of killers. In the royal chambers, the air grew thick with worry. Servants carried basins of steaming water laced with camphor to purify the room. Doctors came and went, prescribing tonics, rest, and the same hopeless optimism they gave to the poor. Victoria refused to believe what her eyes already knew. She watched as Albert's once upright figure stooped with fatigue, as the bloom faded from his cheeks, and as the blood on his handkerchief grew darker each day. She ordered the windows thrown open for air, even as the December frost crept across the floors. The palace shivered with him. Outside the castle walls, Londoners followed every bulletin. His illness made the distant monarchy suddenly human, fragile, mortal. If a prince could fall, what hope had they? The poor lit candles in the streets, the churches filled with prayers. Even the workers in the factories paused, to their machines, to listen for the bells that would announce his recovery or his death. The bells tolled on December 14th. Albert was 42. The Queen, inconsolable, ordered the palace draped in black. She withdrew from public life, her grief consuming her as completely as the disease had consumed him. She would wear mourning for the rest of her life, and her sorrow became the empire's emblem, an entire nation dressed in black for a man taken by a sickness no one dared to name aloud. Albert's death carried consequences beyond grief. For the first time, the illusion of royal immunity shattered. The upper classes could no longer pretend that tuberculosis was a disease of poverty or vice. The plague was no respecter of titles. Behind the curtains of every great house, the same hollow cough could be heard. The Queen's doctors, once satisfied with moral explanations, now turned to the laboratories of Europe for answers. In her mourning, Victoria inadvertently became the unintentional patron of medical progress. Years later, when germ theory spread through England, scientists would look back and see in Albert's death a turning point, the moment when denial gave way to inquiry, when the crown itself had borne the mark of infection. The cough that had echoed through Windsor did not just still a man's heart, it awakened a kingdom. It taught the Victorians, at last, that disease was not divine punishment nor social shame. It was simply breath shared, fragile and fleeting, even beneath a crown. In the corner of a modest studio off Fleet Street stands a high-backed chair upholstered in dark velvet. The photographer calls it the sitter, though most who rest upon it no longer sit of their own will. It is the seat of the departed, the resting place for the newly dead who are to be remembered as though still alive. By the height of the tuberculosis years, post-mortem portraiture had become both profession and ritual. Death came too often and too swiftly for painters to keep pace. Photography, with its promise of instant eternity, filled the void. Families who had hidden their sick behind curtains now brought their bodies into the light. They could not save them, but they could preserve their likeness, one last act of defiance against the White Plague's hunger for erasure. The photographer works quietly. He moves with the solemn patience of a priest. The body arrives wrapped in a shroud or seated stiffly in a hired carriage, escorted by relatives whose eyes are red but dry. He unwraps the fabric and begins the transformation. The hair is combed, the lips are moistened, the eyes, if not already glass, are painted faintly upon closed lids. The hands are arranged upon the lap, a book or bouquet slipped between them. He adjusts the drape of the dress, straightens the collar, and tilts the chin just so. A brace, hidden behind the chair, holds the head upright. The exposure lasts a few seconds only, but in that stillness, time ceases entirely. The glass plate captures what breath no longer can. When the flash of light fades, the room smells faintly of smoke and ether. The mother exhales. The photographer lowers his lens and whispers, "It is done." Later, the image will be printed in sepia tones, framed and placed on a mantelpiece beside living portraits. Visitors will not know which smile belongs to the dead. For the Victorians, this blurred boundary between life and death is not morbid, it is mercy. In a world where the cough can take anyone at any hour, memory must be tangible, something that can be touched, polished, and dusted. The photographer keeps a ledger of names. Many are familiar: clerks, seamstresses, infants, wives, and increasingly, men of education. Next to each he records the cause: cathisis, decline, consumption. His pen hardly needs to lift between them. Sometimes he wonders if the disease itself is the city's true artist, thinning faces, whitening skin, perfecting the symmetry of despair. He photographs hundreds, yet remembers only fragments: a lock of hair kept by a mother, a widow's trembling hands, a little boy whose eyes refuse to close. He does not speak of it to friends. They think his work grim, but he knows it is necessary. The dead must be seen, or the living will forget how fragile they are. On certain nights, when the fog presses against the studio windows and the city is muffled in silence, he looks upon the drying prints hung in rows across the wall. Dozens of faces stare back, calm, luminous, eternal. The city outside still coughs and groans, but here in this narrow room, all is still. The photographer's chair waits for morning, for another carriage, for another family in black. Each new portrait becomes both memorial and warning that in the age of progress, the most lasting image is not invention or empire, but the still face of one who can finally breathe no more. By the final decade of the 19th century, the sickness that had seemed eternal began, at last, to tremble. Not vanish, not weaken, but falter just enough to let the world imagine an end. Hope, for the first time, became a matter not of prayer, but of science. And that, perhaps, was its own quiet miracle. It began with the laboratories. Across Europe, the great cities that had once filled with the echo of coughing now filled with the clink of glass. London, Paris, Berlin, all alight with the fever of discovery. The microscope had turned the invisible into the knowable, and in its glow, every man in a white coat believed he might be the one to break the curse. Doctors who had spent years delivering soft condolences began to speak with a new tone, precise, bright, almost mechanical. They measured, they tested, they named. Hope, they said, could be manufactured. Philanthropists joined the cause. Men like Lord Shaftesbury and Andrew Carnegie endowed research institutes, transforming death into data. The same empire that had conquered continents now sought dominion over disease. Hospitals were rebuilt with tiled walls and wide windows, so that even architecture could mimic the cleanliness of science. Posters appeared across London promising the triumph of medicine. Children in the streets, still coughing, were told they would live to see a cure. In the wards, the change was subtler. Nurses were taught to sterilize instruments in boiling water, to wash their hands between patients. The old belief in good air gave way to ventilation systems, calibrated like clockwork. And yet, despite the rigor, the wards remained full. Patients still died, their lungs collapsing under the weight of a cure not yet found. But something had shifted in the language. They were no longer consumptives, they were cases. They were not dying, they were under observation. In 1895, word spread of a marvel from Germany, a machine that could see through flesh. Wilhelm Röntgen's discovery of the X-ray turned hospitals into cathedrals of light. For the first time, physicians could peer directly into the body, could watch the lungs darken as the disease spread. "It is as though we have been blind and now see," one surgeon wrote. The newspapers called it divine sight. The poor called it witchcraft. For those dying of tuberculosis, it was both a blessing and a curse to witness one's own ruin revealed on glass. And yet, the world clung to the illusion of progress. Every headline, every patent, every new serum promised that the White Plague's reign was ending. Children collected postcards of the great doctors as though they were heroes. A new faith took root not in prayer books, but in petri dishes. The real cure was still decades away, but in those years, hope itself became medicine. It filled the hospitals, the parlors, even the poorest homes. A family might lose a daughter and still whisper, "The next one will live." For the first time, they could imagine a future where death was not inevitable, where breath was not rationed. And though the coughs still echoed across London, they were met now with something stronger than resignation. It was the sound of science breathing in steady, deliberate, defiant, preparing, at last, to exhale. It rises above the valley like a white cathedral, its windows catching the morning light, its balconies spilling out toward the horizon. The townspeople below call it simply the hill. They watch the narrow carriages ascend each day, carrying patients who never wave back. The building seems to float between earth and sky, a place neither of the living nor the dead. The sanatorium was born from hope, though it often served despair. By the turn of the 20th century, the belief in clean air had become a creed. Doctors spoke of the climate cure with the conviction of missionaries. If medicine could not save the lungs, perhaps the mountains could. So, across Europe and Britain, sanatoriums sprouted like monasteries in the clouds where silence, discipline, and sunlight might heal what science could not. This one, perched above the Welsh countryside, was considered among the finest. Its wards faced south to drink the sun. Its verandas were lined with rows of iron-framed beds, where patients lay bundled in wool, staring into the distance. From dawn until dusk, they followed a strict rhythm. Rest, breathe, eat, breathe, sleep, breathe. Conversation was discouraged. Excitement was forbidden. Even laughter was thought to strain the lungs. The cure, as prescribed, was not to live, but to endure. The days unfolded in a ritual of repetition. In the mornings, nurses in starched aprons glided through the halls, their footsteps echoing like metronomes. They served warm milk, broth, and eggs to those strong enough to eat. The weaker ones received only sips of cod liver oil, which clung to their tongues and dreams alike. At 10, the doctor would make his rounds tall, brisk, his presence measured in whispers. He asked questions to which no one dared answer honestly. To say worse was to invite hopelessness. To say better was to lie. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, smelling of pine and rain. On good days, the patients were wheeled onto the terrace, their chairs arranged in perfect symmetry. They lay there, motionless, their blankets pulled to their chins, faces turned toward the sun as though worshipping it. The nurses called them the sleepers. Though most were awake, their eyes half open, counting clouds. Some prayed, others simply waited. Letters arrived once a week. Some were read aloud, others were left unopened, too heavy with the weight of home. The dying often requested a window seat for their final hours. They said they wanted to see the world one more time. But the truth was simpler. They wanted the air to touch them, to feel the thing that had both sustained and destroyed them. At night, the sanatorium glowed faintly against the hills, its lights visible for miles. The locals whispered that the souls of the patients drifted down into the valley with the mist. When the wind was right, they said, you could hear coughing echo across the moors, a faint chorus of breath clinging to the earth. For decades, the hill endured, its white walls bright against the green. It promised healing, and sometimes, by chance or strength, a few walked away cured. But most left only by carriage, their beds quickly filled by others. The sanatorium stood as both miracle and mausoleum, proof of humanity's will to survive and its unwillingness to accept death without ritual. And though the world below changed, trains grew faster, cities larger, medicine wiser, the building remained, watching from its height, quiet and eternal as the sky it worshipped. The ward is quiet, except for the steady hum of breathing and the occasional cough that rattles through the long rows of beds. Nurses move softly, gloved hands adjusting pillows, brushing away stray locks of hair, measuring doses of syrup and laudanum with ritual precision. In this stillness, even the faintest sound carries weight. And yet, beneath it all, there is another sound, one deliberately small, one meant to soothe. The music box. It sits on a high shelf in the corner of the room, a delicate instrument carved from oak and ivory. Its mechanism is simple: a winding key, a cylinder of pins, a metal comb, but in the hands of the ward's staff, it becomes almost magical. Each morning, a nurse winds the key and lets the melody spill across the beds. The notes are faint, tinkling like distant wind chimes or sunlight on ice. The patients, most too weak to speak or move, hear it in the pauses between coughs, in the rhythm of their own shallow breathing. The music is not meant to distract from death. It is meant to accompany it, to give shape to the silence that fills the room. Children close their eyes and imagine gardens they cannot walk through. Women whisper prayers or hum along to melodies they learned in childhood. Men whose chests rattle with the echo of disease feel the pulse of rhythm in their bones, as though it can steady the heart and lungs together. Some nights, the music box is played continuously, its song looping for hours. Nurses change shifts, doctors pass through, but the melody remains, a fragile thread binding the ward together. It reminds the living that they are not alone, and it comforts the dying by giving them something to focus on other than breath itself. The music does not heal. It cannot reverse the collapse of lungs, the wasting of bodies, the slow hollowing of ribs, but it shapes the air around them, turning a room filled with fear and sorrow into one of ephemeral beauty. Families send small gifts to the patients: another music box, a little doll, a soft blanket. The administrators sometimes frown, concerned that frivolities will distract from rest, but the nurses know better. The music carries memories of home, of streets and gardens, of voices that once whispered love and laughter. It is a bridge to life beyond the ward, however fleeting. On some evenings, the wind carries the notes beyond the open windows. Villagers walking along the paths below pause, listening to the faint tune rising into the hills. For them, it is an echo of human persistence, a whisper that even amid death, life finds a way to insist upon its presence. When the patient dies, the music stops for a moment. A nurse winds the key once more and plays a note or two, as though signaling farewell. Then the routine resumes. Beds are made, linens changed, and the next patient takes their place. The song begins again, delicate and unbroken, a quiet insistence that even in the age of the White Plague, rhythm and beauty can linger for those who need them most. In the ward, the music box becomes more than a toy. It is witness, companion, and comfort. It is a small defiance against the endless coughs, a gentle rebellion in a room defined by breath, silence, and loss. The microscope sits on the laboratory bench like a sentinel, its brass body polished to a dull gleam. Light falls through the lenses, illuminating slides arranged neatly on the table. Around it, the world is silent, except for the faint scratching of pens and the occasional murmur of an assistant. It is here, in these small, bright rooms, that the invisible enemy is revealed. The ghost in the glass, the hidden terror that has haunted Victorian London for decades. Robert Koch had discovered it, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. To the naked eye, it is nothing. A faint smear on a slide, a subtle shadow beneath a stain. But under the lens, it moves tiny rods, precise and relentless, pulsing in a world too small for most minds to grasp. Each specimen, taken from lung tissue, from the milk of a cow, from the sputum of a patient, is a reminder of the unseen architecture of death. The White Plague, it seems, has a body, and that body is everywhere. In the laboratory, the scientists begin to treat the slides like sacred objects. Each one is washed, stained, and examined with meticulous care. Every movement is precise. A single mistake could ruin a week's work. The bacteria do not forgive sloppiness. They persist, indifferent, waiting to invade, to consume, to remake life in their image. The technicians whisper when they handle them, as if the rods can hear, as if the very air is alive with their presence. The ghost in the glass changes the world. Hospitals adjust their routines. Sheets are boiled, instruments sterilized. Sanatoriums expand their windows, insisting that fresh air must reach every patient. Families of the afflicted learn to fear the very breath of their loved ones. And yet there is hope. For the first time, humans can see what has always been present. They can trace its shape, study its movement, and perhaps one day learn to stop it. Even in the midst of this revelation, there is horror. A single slide carries within it the capacity for death. One tiny smear, one moment of carelessness, could spread the same disease that had hollowed lungs across the city for decades. The researchers work under lamps that cast harsh shadows, their faces pale from long hours of strain. They understand the irony. The very tool that reveals life-saving knowledge is also a mirror of fragility. Outside the laboratory, London goes on as before. Carriages rattle over the cobblestones, factories fill the air with smoke. The families still hide their sick behind curtains, still whisper of a delicate chest instead of naming the disease. The streets still echo with coughing, faint but relentless. But inside the lab, the ghost in the glass sits still, captured and yet ever moving, waiting for knowledge to meet it with action. By evening, the microscopes are wiped clean, the slides stored in rows, labeled and catalogued. The room smells faintly of ether and alcohol. The ghost remains, visible only to those who know how to see it. And in that quiet revelation, the world catches its first glimpse of the truth. The White Plague is no longer invisible. It has shape, it has form, and it has a name. And once seen, it can never be unseen. The White Plague did not respect borders, nor did it halt at oceans. By the late 19th century, the disease had become a global spectre, carried not just through breath, but through trade, migration, and empire. Sailors, merchants, and soldiers unknowingly transported it from the crowded streets of London to the distant corners of the globe. Wherever the British flag flew, wherever trade reached, the cough followed, and with it, the same hollowing of bodies, the same quiet terror that had reshaped lives at home. In Calcutta, the humidity made the air heavy with mildew and disease. The city's teeming population, laborers, clerks, merchants, breathed in smoke, soot, and stagnant water. Tuberculosis flourished in the slums, claiming children before they could walk, mothers before they could hold them. Officials wrote reports to London, noting the rise in mortality among both European colonists and the local population. But there was little interest beyond statistical record. Disease, for the empire, was inconvenient, not urgent. In the Caribbean, soldiers stationed on forts along the coast found themselves coughing in unison. The warm air did little to dry the wetness in their lungs, and the smallpox vaccines did nothing against this invisible enemy. The doctors who attended them noted the wasting, the fever, and the persistent cough, writing in careful script for the Home Office. Pulmonary decline noted, cases rising, yet no immediate cure existed. Isolation was difficult, and the tropical climate made the disease harder to recognize until it was too late. Even in the colonies of Africa and the Pacific, the pattern repeated: missionaries returning from remote villages, merchants traveling for tea and sugar, and settlers attempting new lives, all carried the same invisible rod. They arrived in port cities with thin faces, red-stained handkerchiefs, and lungs already failing. The illness did not discriminate by race, wealth, or status. A man could command a plantation, a regiment, or a shipping company, and yet still collapse under the same fever that had killed the poor washerwomen of London. The empire responded as it always did, with bureaucracy and moral judgment. Reports emphasized hygiene, proper housing, and Christian instruction. Sanatoriums were suggested for the few with means, while pamphlets instructed the working poor to avoid crowded spaces, to ventilate their homes, to keep their children's chests warm. But across the vast reaches of the empire, these instructions were often ignored, impossible to enforce, or irrelevant to the environment itself. The disease adapted to new climates, new customs, and new bodies, with the quiet inevitability of a ghost. Within the metropole, the reports of colonial deaths added to the urgency of germ theory. Scientists studied samples brought home by ship, observing the same rods in the lungs of men who had never seen London, proving once and for all that tuberculosis was not a punishment, nor a symptom of poverty alone. It was life, invisible, contagious, and relentless. By the turn of the century, the empire had learned that conquest did not confer immunity. Trade and transport had made every port, every outpost, every settlement susceptible. The White Plague had traveled further than any soldier, ship, or flag, claiming bodies silently, leaving no territory untouched. And in that silence, the empire learned a bitter truth. Its wealth, its power, its reach, could not shield it from the same fragile breath that had haunted its streets at home. Her name was Margaret Lenton, though few remembered it beyond the narrow corridors of the hospital where she lay. She was small, delicate, her skin pale as parchment, her chest rising and falling with each shallow, rasping breath. But beneath that frail exterior burned a defiance no illness could extinguish. Margaret had been diagnosed with tuberculosis in her late teens, and for 5 years she had refused to submit quietly to the slow erosion of her body. The nurses were wary of her spirit. Most patients resigned themselves to the rhythm of the ward. Sleep, cough, medicated meals, sunlight, sleep again. Margaret refused to obey those invisible rules. She sat upright in her bed, arms folded over the thin blanket, and demanded her meals be brought at the exact hour, not early or late. She insisted on walking along the balcony when she was told to rest, and when she had the strength, she spoke to the other patients, reading aloud from the books she brought with her, keeping their minds alive when their bodies were already weakening. Her doctors were equally perplexed. They admired her determination, but it frustrated them. Tuberculosis was not swayed by temperament. It did not pause because someone insisted on singing or reading aloud. Yet Margaret seemed to bend its course, delaying its progress in ways that confounded their expectations. "She is remarkable," one wrote, "but her lungs are still failing." Word of her spirit spread beyond the hospital walls. Families of other patients visited, not just to bring flowers or gifts, but to witness her vitality. Nurses whispered of her courage in the hallways, telling one another that her stubbornness alone seemed to extend life, however briefly. Margaret welcomed their admiration with a quiet smile, but she refused to let it define her. She was not a muse, nor a symbol. She was a woman fighting for every shallow, precious breath. Even the administration noticed. They allowed her small liberties that other patients would never have received. Extra sunlight, the occasional fruit, a window left open long after curfew. And yet, her defiance was not just for comfort. Margaret wanted her illness to be known, not hidden behind curtains or polite euphemisms. She wrote letters to the newspapers, to the medical journals, describing life within the ward, the sounds of coughing, the smell of disinfectant, the sensation of breath slipping from the body. The editors called it morbid. She called it truth. By the end, tuberculosis claimed her, as it did everyone, but not quietly. When she collapsed, it was in the middle of a lecture she gave to other patients, the notes still in her hands. Her voice faltered, then stopped. The nurses lifted her into bed, her eyes open and unyielding, even as the disease conquered her. She had lived her final moments on her own terms, refusing to vanish quietly into the background of statistics and ledgers. Margaret Lenton became a legend within those hospital walls. For the patients who survived, she remained a symbol of resistance, proof that even in the relentless grasp of the White Plague, one could insist on dignity, insist on presence, insist on life, one breath, one word, one defiant moment at a time. By the early years of the 20th century, the White Plague had begun to force the hand of governments. The disease had traveled through the empire, through homes both grand and squalid, through factories, tenements, and royal palaces alike. Death had become visible, undeniable, and, for the first time, policymakers realized that it could not be ignored. Public health, once a vague concern of local authorities, now demanded urgent, organized action. In London, The Board of Health convened meetings in drafty offices, where clerks filed records and physicians testified before committees. They spoke in hushed tones about mortality statistics, tuberculosis wards overflowing, and the children lost to the disease every year. It was a crisis that cut across class, affecting the poor who lived in tenements and the wealthy who could afford sanitariums. Their shared vulnerability became the impetus for a sweeping campaign to educate, to regulate, to protect. Pamphlets were printed in thousands, distributed in streets, schools, and workplaces. They advised proper ventilation, the avoidance of crowded spaces, and the importance of personal hygiene. Mothers were instructed to wash sheets and clothes with care, to provide children with nourishing foods, and to seek medical help at the earliest signs of cough or fever. Employers were urged to improve conditions in factories. Open windows, remove dust, and allow rest breaks. The advice was practical, but it also carried a moral undertone. Cleanliness, vigilance, and obedience were as necessary as medicine. Hospitals and dispensaries expanded rapidly. Sanatoria were built not only in the hills of Wales and the Alps, but also in the outskirts of industrial cities. They became centers of instruction as much as care, teaching patients and staff about air circulation, nutrition, and rest. Nurses learned new routines, sterilizing instruments, monitoring vital signs, documenting every cough, and isolating the most infectious. The wards became classrooms, and the sick students, albeit unwilling, in lessons of survival. The government also addressed milk and food supplies. Inspectors visited dairies, ensuring that milk was boiled and clean. But for many families, especially the poor, these improvements were slow to reach the table. Tuberculosis thrived where oversight lagged. In response, the crusade extended beyond London to factories in Manchester, tenements in Liverpool, and docks in Glasgow. Public posters warned of infection, instructing citizens to cover mouths when coughing and to ventilate their homes. It was an early example of health as civic responsibility, linking individual behavior with collective survival. Newspapers reported the campaign with a mixture of optimism and fear. Headlines praised the government's efforts. Clean air, clean lungs, London takes action. Yet in the same pages, obituaries quietly noted the thousands still dying, the wards still full, the children whose coughs had already become a death sentence. For the public, education became both hope and anxiety. Knowledge was power, but it could not undo the disease that had claimed so many. The public health crusade did not end the White Plague, but it changed its course. Cities began to breathe differently. Families washed more diligently. Employers learned to recognize the cost of neglect. And doctors, armed with knowledge of germs and contagion, could finally speak of prevention rather than mere consolation. For the first time, the fight against tuberculosis was not only personal, it was civic. The war for breath had become a campaign for society itself, a lesson that progress demanded vigilance, cooperation, and the courage to face the invisible enemy openly. He sat at his writing desk, quill poised, the candle flickering so that the shadow of his hand danced across the paper like a ghost. Thomas Everard had been a poet of some renown. His verses read aloud in smoky parlours and published in journals that circulated through London and beyond. But now, at the age of 27, consumption had claimed him as surely as it had claimed his mother, his sister, and countless neighbours. The illness had hollowed his chest, thinned his limbs, and left his breath shallow, yet his mind remained unbroken, sharp as the edge of a pen. The fever burned intermittently, surging and fading, as he laboured to inscribe his final lines. Each word was measured, deliberate, chosen not for rhyme or metre, but for endurance, for clarity, for proof that he had existed fully even as his body betrayed him. He wrote of clouds and mist, of fog-laden streets, of the hollow coughs echoing through the tenements. He wrote of the air itself, heavy with soot and disease, carrying death on every breath. And he wrote of hope, faint, fleeting, stubborn hope, the kind that allowed him to continue when the lungs could no longer bear the effort. Visitors to his room were few. A nurse brought water, a mother whispered encouragement, a friend handed him ink and parchment. Each interaction required negotiation. Move too quickly, and he would gasp. Speak too loudly, and he would cough until blood stained the pages. The act of communication itself became a perilous exercise, a reminder that even the simplest gestures carried risk. Yet in the silence between coughs, Thomas found rhythm. His hand moved across the page with the precision of a musician. Letters curled, sentences formed, and images arose from the ink like smoke. He imagined the streets of London below the clatter of carriages, the smell of coal, the cries of children, and he wove it into his work. He wrote for the living, but he also wrote for the absent, for those who had already succumbed to the slow erosion of the White Plague. On the final night, he finished the poem. The quill fell from his fingers. He leaned back, exhausted, and looked around his small room. The candle guttered, casting his shadow long against the wall. Outside, the fog pressed against the window pane, thick and unyielding. His lungs, fragile as the paper upon which he had written, took one last shallow, deliberate breath. Then he closed his eyes. The poem, completed, was his testament. Friends carried the manuscript to publishers. Family framed the pages. Critics would later praise the work as haunting, prophetic, and uncommonly beautiful, marveling at the clarity and depth of the voice. Few understood the context, that each line had been written while life itself was leaving him, that each word had been fought for, inhaled and exhaled as carefully as the breath that sustained him. Even as Thomas Everard passed into silence, his words endured. The coughing streets, the fog, the fevered nights, all were captured in ink and verse, preserved beyond the decay of flesh. For the poet, the final act was not to survive, but to speak, not to live, but to leave a line behind, a trace in the air that had once been heavy with disease. In this, he defied the White Plague one last time, turning mortality into memory and breath into art. The dawn was pale and still, as if the world itself held its breath in cautious anticipation. Across London, the streets were quieter than they had been in decades. The factories still smoked, the carriages still rumbled, but there was a sense of expectation in the air, a faint hum beneath the daily noise, as if the city were listening, and it was listening for the one sound it had not heard clearly in generations, the simple, unlabored act of breath. For over half a century, the White Plague had stalked every household, every factory, every alleyway. Its reach was indiscriminate, claiming poets, laborers, children, and royalty alike. Mothers had learned to hold their own breath as their children gasped. Husbands had counted every shallow inhalation as a victory. Families had isolated the sick, washed their linens, and burned their belongings to keep the invisible enemy at bay. Yet it persisted, relentless, indifferent, like the city itself had learned to cough. But now, after years of research, of trial and error, of laboratories lit by gaslight and magnified by microscopes, the tide began to shift. Germ theory had illuminated the unseen enemy, and with that knowledge came the first glimmers of control. Pasteurization made milk safe, proper ventilation was enforced in tenements and factories, and public health campaigns educated the populace about contagion. Doctors no longer spoke only of hope. They could act. They could slow the disease, isolate it, and eventually treat it. In the wards and sanatoria, the change was subtle at first. Patients still coughed, still weakened, but the administration of care improved. Fresh air, sunlight, proper nutrition, and early attention to symptoms meant that lungs could be spared further damage. Children survived where once they would have succumbed. The dying now had a fighting chance, even in the poorest districts. The city began to breathe differently, hesitantly, experimentally. For families long bereft, the return of calming breath was miraculous. Mothers no longer held their infants rigidly, fearing the invisible thief that had once roamed freely. Lovers could lean closer without panic, Workers in the factories could take a full inhale without counting it as a risk. Even the poorest could taste the possibility of life uninterrupted. The plague had not vanished entirely, it would linger, but its dominion was no longer absolute. In the laboratories, scientists documented every victory. The bacillus was understood, tracked, and occasionally stopped in its tracks. Vaccinations were being developed. Early antibiotics were on the horizon, and for the first time, the future looked different. No longer was every cough a death sentence. No longer did Londoners measure life in shallow breaths. The city exhaled, collectively, slowly, carefully. Windows were opened wide, curtains tied back, doors left ajar. Children laughed in the streets once more, voices rising above the hum of industry. Mothers watched with relief, husbands with wonder. And somewhere in a quiet room, a nurse smiled as she watched a patient inhale deeply, fully, without hesitation. The White Plague had been unrelenting, merciless, and invisible. But now, for the first time in generations, its power had been contained. The breath that had been stolen returned tentative, fragile, yet undeniable. London, and indeed the world, had learned to live again, one inhalation at a time. Even now, long after the last sanatorium closed, after the last laboratory slide was archived, and the city streets no longer echo with the coughs that once defined an era, the White Plague leaves its mark. Tuberculosis is no longer the merciless thief it once was, yet the echo of its passage remains in architecture, in literature, in the collective memory of a city that learned to fear its own air. London still breathes, but it remembers. In the narrow alleys of East End, the tenements bear traces of that time. The soot-stained bricks, the narrow windows, and the ever-present damp are reminders of a world where air could kill. Families still speak in hushed tones of great-grandparents who succumbed to the disease, recalling the names of those lost, the rituals performed in their absence, the isolation enforced not by law, but by fear. In the attic of one such home, faded letters from a sanatorium, now yellowed and brittle, lie stacked neatly beside old photographs, the only witnesses left of lives measured in shallow breaths. In the grand houses of the city, the echo is quieter, subtler. Portraits of pale brides, young artists, and courtiers whose lives ended too soon hang in drawing rooms, their gazes still unnervingly serene. Families tell their stories with care, omitting the shame and focusing on the dignity preserved. The bloodied handkerchiefs are long gone, the curtains drawn back permanently, but the knowledge of what happened is never entirely erased. The illness, once invisible and absolute, has become legend, memorialized in diaries, poems, and post-mortem photographs. Medical science, too, bears the echo. Germ theory reshaped every approach to disease. Sanitation became policy, vaccines and antibiotics eventually became available. Hospitals learned to prioritize ventilation, hygiene, and systematic observation. The death toll decreased, but the lessons remained. Tuberculosis transformed medicine itself, creating a discipline in which prevention became as crucial as cure. It taught the importance of observation, of data, of understanding that disease is not moral judgment, but biological fact. Yet, perhaps the greatest echo resides in the human spirit. Across generations, Londoners and the world beyond have carried the fear, the caution, and the vigilance learned during those decades. Mothers still notice the first cough, and fathers still remember the panic of a child struggling for air. Public health, born of necessity, endures. Awareness, caution, and intervention have saved countless lives since. And in quiet moments when the wind presses through open windows and the streets are empty, the city seems to remember itself as it once was, a place where every breath mattered, where air itself could be both gift and threat. The White Plague is gone in its tyranny, but it lingers in memory. It shaped families, societies, and the very laws of health. It demanded innovation, compassion, and observation, leaving behind an invisible imprint in lungs, hearts, and minds. The streets no longer cough, the hospitals are no longer filled with dying youth, and yet the echo remains, a reminder of fragility, resilience, and the extraordinary human capacity to endure. The city breathes on. The laboratories record new discoveries. Families rebuild, love, and laugh, where they once feared to exhale, but beneath every inhale, somewhere in the quiet, is the echo of a century in which air itself was both enemy and teacher. And that echo, haunting yet instructive, ensures that the memory of the White Plague and the lessons it demanded will never be forgotten.